Chapter 320. Under the gloomy twilight, the monster tide was like a black ocean. In front of the black ocean stood 5 demon experts. There was an even larger shadow in the sky, as if it was the reflection of the black ocean. Chen Chongsheng and Su Yorong stood on the stone platform in front of the main entrance of the mausoleum. Separated by several thousand zhang along the divine path, they looked at this magnificent and terrifying scene. They looked at the black piece of wood in the hands of the girl at the very front that emitted countless rays of light. They knew that their previous calculations were correct. The soul pivot was in front of the obsidian sarcophagus, but the soul wood was in the hands of the demons. Su Yorong said with some regret, "I have cultivated the Tao since I was young, but I believe that the Tao cannot be followed. The so-called calculations are only to talk about human affairs. From the looks of it now, you and I can only leave it to fate." Chen Chongsheng looked at the black ocean in front of the mausoleum and the shadow in the sky. He said, "I believe in fate, but I don't believe that fate can decide everything." When he said this, he was very serious and also very calm. Only the final word, matter, trembled a little, indicating that he was still somewhat nervous. He composed himself and continued, "The soul wood really is in the hands of the demons. No wonder we did not encounter any monsters on our way to the mausoleum of Zhou, but these demons clearly could have commanded monsters to kill us a long time ago, so why didn't they do so, and instead helped us clear the path?" Su Yorong said, "Last time when we passed by that patch of autumn reeds, they said that the greatest possibility was that they needed us to help them guide the way. From this, it could be seen that in the eyes of the demons, the location of the mausoleum of Zhou was at least far more important than their lives. Why were the demons searching for the mausoleum of Zhou? What was inside that they absolutely had to obtain? No matter how they thought about it, it should be the having blade technique carved on the walls of the obsidian sarcophagus." Thinking of this, Chen Chongsheng and Su Yorong glanced at each other. Now that the having blade technique had been destroyed, only by combining the words and pictures that they had memorized in their minds could the blade technique reappear. Using this to threaten the demons in exchange for a way out? He used his eyes to inquire. "It's useless." Su Yorong looked at the cold eyes of the girl at the bottom of the divine path, and shook her head. The phoenix and the peacock were fated rivals. The meeting of the 2 geniuses of different races in the Garden of Zhou was what gave rise to so many stories. In that decisive, or even bitter, battle at the peak of Sunset Valley, no matter what kind of terrifying strength Nank displayed, she calmly responded, concealing her victory. Even when the zither-playing old man entered the battle at the end, causing her to be heavily injured and fall into the abyss, the instant she was about to enter a desperate situation, her bloodline underwent a second awakening. She sprouted a pair of pure white wings and broke through the night sky. If it were not for the fact that she had to save Chen Chongsheng in this battle, she would undoubtedly be the victor, as long as she could leave the Garden of Zhou alive. However, the current her, although her life was temporarily not in danger, she was still weak and exhausted. She simply did not have the strength to continue fighting, while Nank had clearly recovered to her original state. She was as powerful as she was at the peak of Sunset Valley, perhaps even more tyrannical. Should I regret it? She probably regretted it. She looked at Chen Chongsheng calmly and didn't say anything. Chen Chongsheng did not know that she was looking at him, because he was currently staring at the black ocean in front of the mausoleum. The black ocean was composed of thousands upon thousands of monsters. Countless powerful and bloody cheese soared into the sky, as if they wanted to tear open the sky above the plains. In the monster tide, there were gray flood dragons, demon vultures, and many other monsters with cheese so powerful that his spiritual sense could not detect them, not to mention the terrifying shadow in the sky behind him. If the monsters in the plains from all directions began to attack, this black ocean could directly submerge the mausoleum. Let alone him, even those powerful divine generals at the peak of star condensation, or even saints at the saint realm could only avoid them. unless Zhou Dufu was revived, who could resist such a terrifying monster tide with their own strength. However, whether it was because Zhou Dufu's qi remained in the mausoleum, or because it was controlled by the black wood that emitted countless rays of light, although the monster tide was a little restless, especially the gray flood dragons and demon vultures that had many of their comrades killed by Su Yorong before, constantly emitted mournful cries, they still remained 10 li away from the mausoleum. They did not take a single step closer. The black ocean was a curtain, and a gorgeous stream of light was drawn on it. Seeing this scene, Chen Chongqing thought of the unforgettable encounter in the lake several dozen days ago. His pupils constricted slightly, and the hand that held the hilt of his sword subconsciously tightened. The stream of light instantly passed through the seemingly endless divine path, and arrived at the center of the several hundred zhang tall mausoleum. It arrived in the air in front of Chen Chongqing and Su Yorong. Beautiful and agile wings of light lightly flapped in the dusky light. Between the wings of light were two beautiful women that seemed to be one. Their brows were both extremely beautiful, but their appearance and temperament were extremely different. It could even be said that they were polar opposites. One was dignified, one was charming. One had flowing eyes and was amorous, like a beauty from the flower kingdom. The other had quiet and gentle eyes, and was pure and pleasant, like a daughter of a noble family. Standing side by side, they gave off an extremely great visual and spiritual impact. If Chen Chongqing was a little older, perhaps he would be able to understand this kind of temptation, but he was not even 15 years old. Moreover, he was wholeheartedly cultivating the Tao to seek longevity, so he had never considered such matters. In his eyes, these two women were still the terrifying witches that had almost killed him in the lake. Su Yorong said, "They are Nank's two wings or two maids. One is called Hua Chui and the other is Ning Qiu." This was the first time Chen Chongqing had heard of their names. He was slightly startled, and when he looked at them again, there were some other emotions in his gaze. As he chatted with Su Yorong along the way, he knew that Su Yorong's two wings were indeed spiritual bodies that the Candle Shadow Shaman tribe had used some method to create. They had a spiritual sense and self-awareness, but they had to listen to their master's orders for the rest of their lives. Their life and death were not in their control. With just a thought from their master, they would be annihilated and die. Now that he heard these two names, he did not like them. Hua Chui, Ning Qiu? These were the most common names and origins of servant girls. They gave people a feeling that they were timid and lowly, and that they could not live happily. Of course, he knew that these names were definitely not chosen by them. What he did not like was the demon princess who had bestowed them with these names, and who could control their life and death. Nank's two maids served their master every day, so how could they not see the meaning in his eyes? Hua Chui was the charming beauty with an extremely soft waist and soft eyes. Her pair of watery eyes looked at Chen Chongqing, and with an extremely soft voice she said, "Truly a child who knows how to love others." Ning Qiu was the beautiful and dignified young lady from a noble family, but she did not like the sympathy or even pity in his eyes. She thought to herself, "That day by the lake, you almost died at our hands, yet you actually sympathize with our master for controlling our lives and death. How laughable, how disrespectful." With a sliver of anger, she charged towards the stone platform. "Io, what are you in such a hurry for? I haven't even talked to him yet." Hua Chui was brought to the stone platform by her. She spoke in a somewhat flustered manner, and seemed to be in a flurry. However, her fingertips were already emitting a faint green light. It was extremely treacherous. With a hissing sound, countless specks of green light appeared in the air in front of the high platform of the mausoleum, densely covering the area like stars. The green light was the poison of the peacock plume. Once it entered the flesh, death was inevitable. When they were fighting by the lake, they had tried everything they could think of, but they were still unable to pierce through Chen Chongqing's skin. Now that they were still attacking like this, they must definitely be hiding some other method. Su Yorong quietly watched this scene. Her right hand held the longbow, and her fingers lightly tapped the smooth and ancient body of the bow in a certain rhythm. She was prepared to act at any time when Chen Chongqing could not react. At this moment, she truly did not have any ability to fight, but she could at least use the tong bow to block an attack from the enemy. Chen Chongqing did not give her this opportunity. He took a step forward with his right foot, and the sole of his shoe created a splash on the stone platform. His strength moved from his waist to his shoulder, and then to his wrist. The dagger turned into a perfectly straight line, piercing towards the edge of the stone platform. With a crisp crack, the air around the edge of the stone platform seemed to have been directly pierced through by his dagger. What was even more miraculous was that in the surroundings of the perfectly straight line that his dagger had pierced out, countless pure white snowflakes suddenly condensed in the air. These snowflakes were at least 10 times larger than the snowflakes that were naturally formed. They were beautiful and concrete. The snowflakes drifted down, and just happened to envelop the pair of light wings. The two maids within the wings of light, in terms of individual battle prowess, were both at the upper level of ethereal opening, the same as him. After combining, their battle prowess had increased by countless times, which was why they had not given Chen Chongqing any chance that day by the lake. Today, in order to show off in front of their master, they had even secretly prepared other method. However, they did not think that all of their follow-up methods would be broken by Chen Chongqing's dagger before they could even be used. The dagger that Chen Chongqing used had not appeared on the continent for at least a decade. It had only appeared once in the Grand Examination 2 months ago, so no one recognized it. He used the Orthodox Academy's toppling mountain staff. In terms of sword speed, the Orthodox Academy's toppling mountain staff could not compare to the Heavenly Academy's sword of hithering light. In terms of sword force, the Orthodox Academy's toppling mountain staff could not compare to the 3 swords of Wenshui, nor could it compare to the Lishan sword Sex Wind and Rain great swords. However, the toppling mountain staff was a staff technique that the teachers of the Orthodox Academy used to educate students who violated the rules. The most important thing about it was the word reason. His dagger seemed unreasonable, but it was actually very reasonable. The reason was the black frost cold chi on the dagger, and the tens of thousands of snowflakes drifting down from above the stone platform. Nank's 2 maids were too fast, so fast that even using the Yesher step was meaningless. Moreover, the area of the stone platform was too small, inconvenient to use, and he had no way of fighting with them in the air. Therefore, he had to restrict their speed, and control this battle within a relatively small space. At the same time, the Orthodox Academy's toppling mountain staff also relied on the word strict. Strict meant not being flexible. You cannot avoid it. These 2 words were the heart of Chen Chongqing's dagger. Together with the black frost cold chi, this dagger could be said to be extremely cold. The snowflakes fell and touched the faint green light. In an instant, the green light became incomparably dark. The cold sword energy took advantage of the situation, and pierced straight at the 2 girls in the wings of light. In the air in front of the mausoleum's stone platform, a strange cry filled with anger and unwillingness suddenly rang out. The wings of light moved quickly, and the snowflakes were fanned away. In an instant, they retreated several dozen zhang away. Hua Chui and Ning Qiu's faces were pale. A stream of fresh blood slowly flowed down from between their bodies. Looking at Chen Chongqing, who was standing at the edge of the stone platform with his sword in hand, their eyes were filled with shock and disbelief. Yesterday I drove 1,000 kilometers home. Although I'm tired, I'm actually very satisfied. There will be a second chapter today, but I really can't guarantee that I can write it before 7 o'clock. When I write it, I'll update it. Chapter 321. That day by the lake, Nank's 2 attendants had combined and Chen Chongqing no longer had a chance. He was not their match at all and was about to be shaken to death. He had relied on the silver chests and roasted lamb to find a sliver of life, and then used the yellow paper umbrella to escape. But now, in terms of time in the plains of the unsetting sun, only a few dozen days had passed since that bloody and treacherous battle, yet he was able to force back the combined attack of the two attendants with a single strike and even wound them. How could a cultivator improve so much in such a short amount of time? Just what had happened to his body? From this strike, it was clear that Chen Chongqing's cultivation level had not changed at all. It was still at the upper level of ethereal opening. At the same time, his true essence was still much less than cultivators of the same level. This sword technique was indeed exquisite, but the greatest difference was that his true essence had somehow become abnormally cold. He had actually used the sword energy to condense a large snowflake. But this was not the most important change. The most important change was the change in his sword intent. His sword intent was incomparably condensed and had already become tangible. It must be known that the intent followed the heart. How could his heart of the sword be so smooth and bright in a few dozen days? The shock only lasted for a moment. There was no time to think more deeply in the battle. With the sound of the wings of light flapping, the two attendants turned into a streak of light and once again attacked the stone platform. At the edge of the stone platform, a bright sword glow illuminated the surrounding space. The sword glow appeared so suddenly. It was a blazing white like lightning. Swish! The sound of the sword cutting through the air rose. The streak of light stopped and then quickly retreated. It turned into countless specks of light in the air several dozen zhang away and then disappeared. It was still the toppling mountain staff of the Orthodox Academy. The sword energy was still cold, the sword intent was still condensed, and the heart of the sword was still so smooth and bright, so clean that it was hard to imagine. Chen Chongqing held his sword in front of him. There was no expression of joy on his face, nor was he pleased with the sudden disappearance of the wings of light. On the contrary, he became even more vigilant. This was because he was very clear that although his sword intent had improved greatly, and the first sword strike could unexpectedly injure the two maids, the second sword strike shouldn't have such a perfect effect. The lightning-like sword light only injured the left shoulder of the girl called Ning Qiu and didn't heavily injure her. Naturally, it was impossible for it to scatter her light wings. The reason why the wings of light had dissipated into countless specks of light was because someone had confirmed that the two maids were no match for him and did not want them to waste any more time. His gaze followed the drifting specks of light and landed at the end of the several thousand zhang divine path, on the ground in front of the mausoleum. Then, he saw the little girl around 10 years of age. The specks of light landed on her body and disappeared. Her expression did not change because she had been expressionless from beginning to end. Nank gazed at the end of the several thousand zhang divine path, at the young man and woman on the stone platform. She did not say anything. According to her calculations and deductions, Su Yorong had been fleeing the entire time. After killing those monsters earlier on, the blood of the true phoenix should have already been used up. Right now, there should only be the poisonous blood that she had planted in her body. Logically speaking, even if she could last until this mausoleum, she should already be dead, so why was she still alive? However, this did not matter. It was very obvious that she was already extremely weak and had no more strength to fight. Although this fateful confrontation could not be said to be her victory, the god of death was the fairest judge. She would die and she would live. That was enough. The problem was that youth called Chen Chongqing, her teacher Black Robe, did not tell her the entire plan of the Garden of Zhou, so she naturally did not know. Because of the yellow paper umbrella and some other reasons, Black Robe did not have the time to tell her the final decision. She had always thought that Chen Chongqing was the same as Qi Jian and Zhixiu, a target that she had to kill. However, from the looks of it now, he was not as easy to kill as she had imagined. She was not unfamiliar with the name Chen Chongqing. It was not because he had obtained first place upon the first banner in the grand examination, nor was it because he had comprehended all the monoliths of the front mausoleum in one night, nor was it because he was the youngest principal of the Orthodox Academy in history. It was because he was Su Yorong's fiancé. She had never thought that this human youth would actually be able to heal her injuries while fleeing through the grasslands. Moreover, although his cultivation level had not increased, compared to the performance that the two maids had once described in detail in that battle several dozen days ago, his sword intent and battle prowess had clearly made a qualitative leap. What had happened in the grasslands? Or could it be that this change had only occurred after they had entered the mausoleum? As soon as she thought of this, her mood became even worse. Of course, no matter how miraculous Chen Chongqing and Su Yorong's encounters were, she only needed to order the monster tide to attack through the soul wood, and she could still easily kill them. However, she did not do this, because the monster tide still maintained some sort of natural reverence towards the mausoleum. If she wanted to forcefully order them to attack, it would take up too much of her energy. More importantly, she did not want this great and holy mausoleum to be turned into a mess by these extremely stupid monsters that were covered in mud and smelly. If it was possible, she did not want any life form other than herself to approach the mausoleum, much less step into it. If there was really no other way, she could only reluctantly accept Su Yorong and the current Chen Chongqing standing on the high platform in front of the mausoleum. This was because, in her eyes, although they were enemies, they had sufficiently strong bloodlines and innate talents, so they could not be considered as staining the mausoleum. Yes, in her eyes this was a great and holy mausoleum. This was because the human buried in the mausoleum was the person she worshipped the most in her life, even surpassing her teacher, let alone her royal father. She had never revealed such thoughts, and had even purposefully expressed some contrary opinions in Xuelao City. This was because even if the demon race believed in respect for the strong, and there were many demons who secretly worshipped or even worshipped the human in the mausoleum, she was still a noble demon princess, so how could she worship a human? However, she had never lied to her inner heart. She worshipped the human male buried in the mausoleum to no end. In Xuelao City, in the demon domain, her father was as strong as the night sky. Only that man had once torn off a corner of the night sky. Looking at the past and the future, looking at the distant continents and oceans, as long as it was under the starry sky, that man would always be the strongest individual. In her eyes, this kind of expert was worthy of the reverence of all life forms, not to mention the countless secret connections between her sect and that man. This connection had long since become the greatest glory in the depths of her heart. Today, she had finally arrived in front of the mausoleum. Compared to this matter itself, the dignity of the demon princess and her royal father's cold attitude towards her were all not important at all. With this kind of mood, Nank walked along the divine path towards the mausoleum. With her cultivation level, she only needed a moment to cross the divine path, but in order to express her respect to the person in the mausoleum, she did not do so. Her footsteps were very gentle, but her attitude was extremely cautious. She walked very slowly, and her expression was very solemn, as if she was worshipping. As she walked, several hundred dark green tail feathers slowly grew from her back, then began to flutter in the wind. It was so beautiful and bewitching that it could not be described with words. The sun at the edge of the plains had already become a blurry ball of light. The darkness of the night had not yet come, but it was even darker. As she walked along the divine path, she reflected the last of the twilight, becoming brighter and brighter, as if she was burning. Seeing this scene, Su Yorong's eyes also lit up, and then slightly dimmed, because no matter how much she wanted to fight Nank in her current state, she was already powerless to do so. Chen Chongqing's eyes did not become brighter, because his eyes would always be this bright. It was just like how Nank's expression would not change at all, because she would never have any expression. In Tang 36's words, his eyes were like two mirrors. They were bright and often made people panic when they looked at them. He was the same as Su Yorong. He could also clearly sense that through her cautious walk on the divine path, as if she was worshipping, Nank had already adjusted her state of cultivation to an almost perfect state, displaying an unimaginable strength. However, different from Su Yorong, he did not have any desire to fight. He did not want to fight with Nank in her current state at all. This was the greatest difference between him and peerless geniuses like Su Yorong and Nank. He would never fight for the sake of fighting. He would never win for the sake of winning. When he did these things, it was usually only for one reason: to live. To live. He believed that this was the most sacred reason, or meaning. So he did not need to adjust, did not need to think quietly, did not need to worship, and even more did not need to bathe, burn incense, or fast for 3 days. When he had no choice but to start fighting, then he would definitely have already made his preparations. However, his state today did not seem too perfect. This was extremely likely to be the last battle of his life. He did not have any confidence, but this was not a problem, because he had already won far too many battles that had no reason to win. The problem was, when he should be focusing on this battle, he was somewhat distracted. He always felt that there were some things that he had not finished. At this moment, Nank had already walked to the last section of the divine path. She was still over 100 zhang away from him. In the end, he still could not hold back and turned to look at Su Yorong. "What's wrong?" Su Yorong asked. Chen Chongqing looked at her face. He wanted to extend his hand and touch it, but he did not dare. Su Yorong raised her heavily injured and powerless hand and lightly patted his shoulder, as if she wanted to brush off the snowflakes on his clothes. Those snowflakes had already melted long ago. Chen Chongqing was satisfied. Looking into her eyes, he said very seriously, "If we can leave the Garden of Zhou alive, I will definitely come find you." Su Yorong looked into his eyes and forcefully suppressed her embarrassment. Pretending to be calm, she said, "There's no need, I will come find you." "Okay." Chen Chongqing had never answered so quickly before. If Nank at this moment gave up her attitude of worship and suddenly attacked, perhaps he and she would already be dead. Fortunately, Nank did not do that. After finishing this matter, there was finally nothing else that could distract him. Chen Chongqing looked at the little girl slowly walking over on the divine path. He was calm and focused. Just like countless people had once said, cultivation was never a fair matter. Although he had read the Taoist canon since he was a child and his physique was also different from normal people, having already cultivated to the upper level of ethereal opening at the age of 15, the difference in bloodline talent was not so easy to make up for. Not to mention the fact that the mausoleum was surrounded by the monster tide that had turned into a black sea. This was a battle where there was no chance of survival. However, he was still so calm, displaying a steadiness and calmness that far exceeded his age. If one only looked at his back, the current him actually had the demeanor of a great master of the path of the sword. The reason why he was able to force back a strong enemy with a single strike was because his heart of the sword was already different from before. In this long escape through the grasslands, after several dozen days, what he and Su Yorong did the most was talk. What they talked about the most was cultivation. From the rain temple to the snow temple, from the reeds in autumn to the island of grass in summer, they always talked about this. He had the talent for cultivation, but he did not have any battle experience. Su Yorong had taught him a lot. More importantly, her attitude towards cultivation and life, that indifference, calmness, and easiness, had affected him a lot. This was the Tao heart. The heart of the sword was also a part of the heart of the Tao. In terms of a brightly lit heart of the Tao, in the entire younger generation of the cultivation world, who could be stronger than Su Yorong? When the two swords crossed, the edge became sharper, and the heart of the sword was the same. Right now, his heart of the sword was already brightly lit, so his sword intent was naturally strong and pure. Su Yorong did not know that he was only 15 this year. However, as she looked at his back, her somewhat dim eyes once again lit up, as if the withered mountains had finally welcomed a new rain. She left his side and returned to the main entrance of the mausoleum. She found a corner that could shelter her from the rain, snow, and wind and sat down cross-legged. She wrapped the warm sackcloth around her body. His attitude towards life had also affected her a lot. So, she closed her eyes and began to rest. Done. And please vote for me on Monday. Sorry for troubling everyone. Chapter 322. Nank followed the divine path and arrived several dozen zhang away from the stone platform. She looked at the scene in front of the mausoleum and felt slightly strange. Su Yorong closed her eyes. Her somewhat pale face had a tranquil expression, as if what was about to happen had nothing to do with her. This attitude represented her absolute trust in a certain person. That certain person was naturally Chen Chongqing, who was standing at the edge of the stone platform. Nank looked at Chen Chongqing, somewhat confused. Even if he was Su Yorong's fiancé, how could she trust him so much? Chen Chongqing was also looking at her. That morning, by the lakeside densely covered with reeds, he had only met Nank once before turning around and entering the grassland. Only after several dozen days had passed did he see this terrifying demon girl again. Calling her a young girl was not even accurate. From her clear and immature appearance, she seemed to be around 10 years old. The distance between her two eyes was rather wide, causing her forehead to seem rather wide as well. Her gaze was indifferent or perhaps dull, giving people a dull feeling. It was precisely because the peacock's soul between her eyebrows was too powerful. He confirmed that he had not seen wrongly back then. This girl was indeed sick. He thought about it but did not say anything. After fleeing for so long in the grassland, he had already thought it through. Cross-eyed was not a nice word to hear, and he was currently very nervous. The hand that gripped the hilt of the dagger did not sweat, but his knuckles were rather white. He already knew that Nank was the demon princess, and it was said that she was the one with the greatest bloodline talent out of all the children of the demon lord. Even more terrifying was that she was the only disciple of the mysterious and powerful demon military advisor, Black Robe. Back at the lakeside, he could not even defeat Nank's two maids. Even if his swordsmanship had greatly improved, how could he be her opponent? A true battle never had a prelude. This battle that occurred on the stone platform of the mausoleum would decide the ownership of the mausoleum of Zhou, and would decide the final success or failure of the demon's great plot. Naturally, there would not be any long-winded speeches or probing. Without any delay, without any warning, as the wind blew around the mausoleum, the battle began. The pair of dark green wings behind Nank flapped in the wind. With a light hum, it represented that the air was rapidly deforming and being shaken apart. Her petite body instantly disappeared from where she was, and in the next moment, she appeared in front of Chen Chongqing. She extended her slender index finger, and with a terrifying chi, it pierced towards the center of his eyebrows. She came too fast and her movements were even faster. Chen Chongqing, who had been accumulating his strength for a long time and had already pushed his sword force to the extreme, didn't have time to draw his sword. With her wings, her speed was simply too fast, so fast that it was hard to imagine. In the entire continent she could probably be ranked at the top. Other than people like Jin Yulu, who else could keep up with her? At this moment, any of Chen Chongqing's responses, such as unsheathing, sweeping, stabbing, slicing, chopping, or lifting, were all too late. He was unable to keep up with Nank's speed and rhythm. As long as he tried to make a move, he would definitely be pierced between his eyebrows by her fingertip. Her finger was very slender and looked very ordinary, but the aura it carried was very terrifying. Anyone could imagine what would happen if they were hit by this finger. Therefore, he could only do nothing and retreat into nothingness. This light sound came from Nank's fingertips. The terrifying force had yet to be released, so it did not touch Chen Chongqing's eyebrows. However, it seemed like the space at the edge of the stone platform was about to split open. Chen Changxing suddenly disappeared before her eyes. This finally caused her wooden expression to change slightly. This was something very difficult to understand, but it actually did not make her think too much less raise her guard. This was because she understood, but did not care. Just as Chen Changxing's figure appeared on the other side of the stone platform, she appeared almost at the same time. She still pointed her finger at his eyebrows. This reality was rather unexpected for Chen Changxing. She was actually able to keep up with his footsteps? It had to be known that this did not have much to do with speed. He was using the most mysterious and unpredictable Yesher step, which was the fastest to evade in a short distance. His figure disappeared once again, and Nank's figure also disappeared with it. In the next moment, his figure appeared in front of the main entrance of the mausoleum. Immediately after, Nank's figure also appeared there. On the high platform in front of the mausoleum, there were no whistling gales. There was only a gentle breeze. The two figures appeared and disappeared without making any sound. It was extremely strange. Chen Changxing had no way of breaking away from her. He had no way of breaking away from the slender finger that was getting closer and closer to his eyebrows. He had no way of breaking away from the terrifying qi and the smell of death. With a single step, he stepped into the dark, avoiding the finger. Only when he appeared did he discover that he had already been forced to the edge of the high platform by Nank. In the grand examination, by the lake, the Yesher step that had allowed him to turn defeat into victory countless times was clearly of no use to Nank. However, at least it had bought him some time. In the soundless and strange movement of the figure, he had walked a very short distance. In the end, he had still walked some distance, giving him the opportunity to strike with his sword. Separated by the slender finger, his gaze fell on her eyebrows. His expression was extremely focused. An extremely bright sword glow appeared at the edge of the high platform, as if it wanted to illuminate the gloomy sky. It was the toppling mountain staff of the Orthodox Academy. This was the staff style that he was most familiar with, and also the sword style that he liked the most, so it was the fastest. However, it was still not as fast as Nank. Or perhaps it could be said that Nank was too strong to the point that she could very casually break his sword. Striking with the sword required at least a movement of the wrist. Bending of the finger only required a movement of the finger. Nank's finger that was piercing towards his eyebrows slightly bent, and the tip of the finger accurately struck the blade of his sword. With a clear clang, it was as if a newly cast bell had been struck by a black stone in a swallow's beak. Chen Changxing's dagger swung up. A power that could be described as boundless and difficult for him to bear traveled along the blade to his shoulder. If it was a normal sword, Nank's finger would have shattered it. If it was a normal human cultivator at the upper level of ethereal opening, Nank's finger would have crippled his shoulder. Fortunately, this dagger was not a normal sword. Chen Changxing's body that had been bathed in dragon blood was even more perfect than a perfect purification. When Nank's finger continued to move towards the space between his eyebrows, the dagger in his hand swung back like a reed. It was still the toppling mountain staff of the Orthodox Academy, but this time it was not a thrust, but a smash. The dagger in his hand smashed towards Nank's wrist. He did not attack Nank's eyebrows, because he had already confirmed that the foundation of speed was still strength. His speed could not surpass Nank's. He could only choose the method that had the shortest distance. This movement was very small, requiring a flip of the wrist. It seemed very casual. At this moment, the dagger was no longer a dagger, but a teaching staff, or perhaps a true teaching staff. What he used was also no longer a sword style, but the true toppling mountain staff. He wanted to strike Nank's wrist, just like a teacher punishing a naughty student. There was a clap. He struck. When writing a fight, I have to simulate it in my head to make sure I can fight it. Now I realize that this is very tiring. I shake my head. The next chapter will be written very late. Chapter 323. With a clap, the dagger in Qin Chongqing's hand accurately struck Nank's wrist. If Nank's previous finger had not been too wondrous, causing the dagger's edge to flutter like willow catkins, he would have had to go with the flow if he wanted to strike in the shortest amount of time. He could have even forcefully twisted his wrist and used the edge of the dagger to strike her wrist. Even if he could not, his seemingly tiny falling dagger still contained an enormous amount of power. Even a mature demon general could not ignore it. Nank's expression did not change, as if she did not feel anything. Although the finger that was as sharp as a feather had deviated from its original direction, it still forcefully continued forward, accurately piercing his abdomen. The high platform in front of the mausoleum exploded with a spring thunder. Qin Chongqing's body turned into a stream of light and flew backwards. With a dull thud, he heavily fell onto the stone door of the mausoleum. Dust flew out from the crack in the door and the crack between the stone door and the ground. It spread out on the stone platform, causing the scene to become somewhat blurry. With the sound of clothes rubbing against the rough stone surface, Qin Chongqing slid down from the stone door to the ground. His two knees were slightly bent, and his face was pale. The blood that was about to gush out from his throat was forcefully swallowed back into his stomach, but the pain from the violent shock to his sea of consciousness could not be eliminated. What was even more terrifying was that the spirit mountain in his ethereal palace rustled and fell countless pieces of stone. Nank's seemingly casual attack had actually almost caused him to be heavily injured. His bent knees gradually straightened, and the surging blood and true essence gradually calmed down. He stood up and stared into Nank's eyes, waiting for the arrival of the next attack. Nank did not immediately launch the second attack. Instead, she looked at his left hand. Qin Chongqing's right hand held the dagger, and his left hand held the yellow paper umbrella. After walking out of the mausoleum, he had always held the umbrella in his hand. Previously, Nank's finger had not been able to directly pierce his abdomen, but had instead pierced the surface of the umbrella. Just like many young girls, Nank's eyebrows were very thin and also somewhat faint. At this moment, when she saw the yellow paper umbrella in his hand, she raised her eyebrows, clearly rather surprised. She had heard the detailed report of the battle with Qin Chongqing from the two maids, Hua Chui and Ning Qiu. She knew that this human youth had an old umbrella, and that umbrella was rather strange. However, it was only at that moment when the terrifying killing intent and power condensed between her fingers was completely blocked by the umbrella that she understood what was strange. But what really surprised her was that Qin Chongqing wasn't knocked down. He actually stood up. Even with the old umbrella that had unimaginable defensive capabilities as a barrier, the majority of her power still fell onto Qin Chongqing's body. He wasn't Su Yurong, nor was he the Yao princess named Luo Luo. Without a strong enough bloodline talent, even if he had a perfect purification, he shouldn't have been able to withstand it. How could he still stand up? She didn't think too much about it, because some accidental accidents couldn't change the general situation. This mighty mausoleum would be inherited by her, and Su Yurong and Qin Chongqing, this adulterous couple, would definitely die by her hands. Your discerning steps aren't right. She looked at Qin Chongqing and said. Behind her, there was a sea of beasts on the grassland, and the sky was as dark as night. When she said those words, she slightly raised her chin, her expression indifferent. She was clearly much shorter than Qin Chongqing, but she looked down on him. She was clearly younger than Qin Chongqing, but her tone was like she was educating her own student. She was clearly a petite, even skinny, little girl, but she seemed like a grandmaster. Qin Chongqing knew that what she said was correct. His discerning steps originated from the inspiration of the member of the Yesher clan that had assassinated Luo Luo, as well as his discovery in the Taoist canons. It was only a simplified version. To be more accurate, this version of the discerning steps was an imitation that a great sage of the orthodoxy had attempted countless years ago. Nank was not a member of the Yesher clan, but she was a member of the purest imperial family of the demon race. Her bloodline talent allowed her to grasp the discerning steps, and it was the perfect version. He had just used the discerning steps to fight against her, and it had to be said that it was a very stupid thing to do. The reason why Nank said those words was because Chen Chongqing's toppling mountain staff of the Orthodox Academy had a very clear sense of admonishment. This made her very unhappy, and she wanted him to understand who had the right to admonish him. After saying those words, she had achieved her goal. Naturally, she would not say any more nonsense. Her figure suddenly disappeared from the edge of the stone platform, and in the next moment, she once again appeared in front of Chen Chongqing. Her fingers still pierced out, still piercing towards the space between his eyebrows. Several dozen days ago, in the wetlands at the edge of the plains, Chen Chongqing looked at her on the shore and said that she was sick, that she was cross-eyed, and that there was a problem with the pineal aperture between her eyebrows being pushed by her powerful soul. Then today, she would poke a bloody hole between his eyebrows, and see if there was a problem inside. At the same time, she wanted to see which was uglier, the three-eyed or the cross-eyed. She was a demon princess with an astonishing bloodline talent, but after all, she was still a little girl around the age of 10, so it was naturally unavoidable for her to be angry. However, her attack was definitely not child's play, and was extremely terrifying. After suffering a crushing defeat in the previous move, Chen Chongqing knew for sure that he could not be faster than her, no matter if it was movement techniques or the speed of his sword. Therefore, he had no way of snatching an attack from her, so he could only defend. The cold wind in the mausoleum suddenly grew stronger, as if it was midwinter. Countless sword glows lit up around his body, and then disappeared, like the first ray of sunlight illuminating the snowflakes in front of a village in the morning. The cold of black frost borrowed the sword energy to appear, and in front of the main entrance of the mausoleum, it transformed into several hundred ice mirrors. The shape and texture of the ice mirrors were incomparably harmonious, and every single mirror was his sword intent. With a crisp crack, the ice mirrors turned into countless pieces of frost and flew out. They formed a snowball in the gloomy air and then shattered. Almost at the same time, the several dozen ice mirrors in front of him shattered at the same time. A strange snow fell in front of the main entrance of the mausoleum. The snowflakes were very hard, even carrying shards of ice, and the cold wind became even more intense. An extremely clear hole appeared in the wind and snow. Anyone could see that it was the result of a thin and small figure. The cold wind brushed against Chen Chongqing's face, causing his thin and long eyelashes to incessantly tremble, unable to stop. Nank's figure appeared, and it was still that thin finger, still piercing towards the space between his eyebrows. With a whoosh, Chen Chongqing's left hand opened the yellow paper umbrella, and the dagger in his right hand slashed down. The true sword of the Orthodox Academy. The tip of Nank's finger landed on the surface of the umbrella, like a tree branch stabbing into a wet and heavy bedding, emitting a soft, muffled sound. Afterwards, she floated backwards, avoiding the extremely pure sword energy. She returned to the edge of the stone platform, and her two wings slowly fluttered in the falling snow. Her finger was not a tree branch, but a mountain. Chen Chongqing's body was once again sent flying, heavily smashing against the stone door of the mausoleum. He stood very close to the stone door, but the impact was even heavier. Even the rainwater and snowflakes that had accumulated on the ground were jolted into the air by this impact. Dust rose again, and he slid down from the stone door of the mausoleum to the ground. This time, he used an even longer amount of time before he could stand up with great difficulty. At this time, the dust had already settled. Looking at Nank, who stood at the edge of the stone platform, his gaze did not waver, but it was somewhat helpless. The little princess of the devil race was simply too powerful. She was powerful to a terrifying extent. No matter whether it was the quantity and density of true essence, the level of cultivation, battle awareness, or the most basic and important of all, strength and speed, he was far inferior to her. Currently, his heart of the sword was brightly lit, and his sword intent was clear and pure. It could be said to be perfect, just like those ice mirrors he had slashed out with his sword before. However, these ice mirrors that could be said to be perfect condensed from sword intent, in front of this little demon princess, could not even withstand a single blow. She was a large mountain. No matter how beautiful the garden was, no matter how perfect and flawless the state of mind, no matter how powerful the body, no matter how cold the sword intent, they would all be directly crushed into fine powder by this large mountain. How could he defeat her? Unless he possessed the same bloodline talent as her, and the same amount of true essence. But he did not. The severed meridians in his body determined that it would be very difficult for him to live past the age of 20, and also determined that certain aspects of his path of cultivation would be much more difficult than normal cultivators. No matter how much starlight he attracted, how much lake water he stored outside his ethereal palace, how much snow he accepted in the wasteland, how much he ignited without fear of death, he would still not be able to produce a sufficient amount of true essence. Then he only had one method, and that was to make his sword even stronger. The 3,000 scriptures of the way and the 10,000 sword styles were right there for people to read and then cultivate. Even if they could recite them backwards, it was still only the 3,000 scriptures of the way and the 10,000 sword styles. To make the sword stronger in a short amount of time, it had nothing to do with the sword style or the move. It could only make the sword intent stronger. In other words, he had to find an even stronger sword intent. Where could he find such a powerful sword intent? Had everything finally come to an end? No, Chen Chongqing did not think so, because he had originally walked through the endless grassland and arrived at this mausoleum because of a strand of sword intent. In the past few days, he had always been thinking about why the strand of sword intent had summoned him here, and whether the strand of sword intent needed him to do something. From the looks of it, this conjecture was not necessarily wrong, but at least at this moment, it was not the strand of sword intent that needed him, but he that needed the strand of sword intent. The strand of sword intent was in the surroundings of this grand mausoleum, but for some reason, it was hidden. The strand of sword intent was definitely waiting for him. The dusk of the plains of the unsetting sun was gloomy. The distant sky was obscured by that terrifying shadow, and the black ocean of monsters on the grassland gave off a cold, bloody stench that constantly drifted into the air. Perhaps it was because of this, but many dark clouds gradually gathered in the sky above the mausoleum, and the air also became damp and cold. Without any warning, a cold rain fell, drenching the huge stones of the mausoleum, and painting the color of the world even darker. Su Yorong was wrapped in sackcloth, leaning against the corner of the mausoleum's main entrance, so that she would not be drenched by the cold rain. Chen Chongqing held the yellow paper umbrella and stood in the cold rain, looking at Nank at the edge of the stone platform. It was unknown what he was thinking. Suddenly, his eyes lit up. It was not because Nank was emitting light, nor was it because he had thought of something. It was because his gaze passed Nank and landed on the distant depths of the grassland, where he saw a rainbow. That rainbow should actually be called a rainbow of light, because it did not have 7 colors. It was only dazzling white. The light in his eyes was the shadow of that rainbow of light. The yellow paper umbrella in his hands began to tremble slightly. The rainbow of light rose from the northwest direction, several dozen li away. There was no rain in the grassland there. There were pools of water everywhere under the weeds and reeds, making it seem more like a sea. There was a weed there, and it suddenly shattered. The surface of the water in the grass that was as calm as a mirror also suddenly shattered. The grass shattered into pieces, and the water shattered into lines. Those lines were very similar to the patterns that were commonly seen on the body of a sword. As for the annual ticket, everyone just needs to vote for free tickets every day. This is a very serious matter. Also, vote for the work. Once the two ends are separated, the editors will directly vomit blood. Actually, I will definitely vomit blood when I write this scene. I can't say that I'm not good at writing battle scenes, because I've written many pretty good battle scenes. However, when I write battle scenes, I really need to put in countless times the effort and intelligence that I don't have much. Everyone knows that I'm essentially still a romance author, right? See you all tomorrow. Chapter 324. The surface of the water began to tremble faster and faster, and the ripples grew denser and denser. The ripples that had dispersed in all directions gradually gathered together, clashing and tearing at each other. In the end, they transformed into countless beads of water that were shaken off the surface of the water. They mixed with the powdered grass and formed a faint green mist. It was somewhat transparent, and when the light from afar pierced through it, one could faintly make out an extremely faint shadow. The shadow was very thin and straight, like an unfinished straight line. It was extremely faint, as if the ink used to draw this line had been filled with lake water. It gave one the feeling that this thin shadow was clearly in the mist, yet it seemed to be somewhere else. It was clearly in front of one's eyes, yet it did not seem to exist. Even if it did exist, it existed in another world, only a projection of some real object in the Garden of Zhou. The green mist was the boundary between the real world and the other world. Logically, this sort of barrier that separated space should have been abnormally sturdy, yet the moment it appeared, the green mist dispersed. It dispersed so quickly that the surrounding space did not even have time to react. A terrifying hurricane arose in the plains. In an extremely short amount of time, the object rapidly dispersed. In reality, this was an explosion. To use simple words to describe this scene, it should be said that the green mist had exploded. However, this explosion did not produce any sound. Besides the whistling of the wind, it was so quiet that it was strange and terrifying. Silence did not mean softness and powerlessness. Countless terrifying cheese and unimaginably sharp edges followed the dissipation of the green mist and spread out in all directions. They easily overtook the hurricanes that had been pushed away by the distortion of space, and were the first to come into contact with the living and inanimate objects in the plains. Whether it was the wild reeds or the weeping golden bells unique to the swamps of the south, countless clumps of grass were chopped up, turning into a fluttering green rain that fell in all directions. The stones in the clumps of grass were also chopped up, turning into fingernail-sized pebbles. They were blown by the wind into the wetlands like sharp arrows, knocking out the frogs and fish hiding in the mud. Soon after, those frogs and fish were also chopped up. Whether it was scales or fins, they were all crushed into powder. The ground of the wetlands was also shattered, as if it had been turned over 72 times by a diligent and foolish farmer. Finally, the water surface shattered, turning into countless droplets of water. The air also shattered, turning into countless gentle breezes. The green mist dispersed, and the slender shadow finally revealed its true form. Within a radius of more than 10 miles, everything within the grassland was chopped into pieces. Everything was turned into fine powder. The true form of the silhouette was still a shadow, extremely faint and indistinct. It couldn't be seen clearly, but one could roughly tell that it was a sword. This thin shadow was not the real body of the sword, but the shadow of the sword. In other words, it was a sword will. When that sword intent sliced through all things and revealed its true form, the entire plains of the unsetting sun, or even the entire garden of Zhou, sensed it. An extremely deep tremor came from the depths of the mausoleum of Zhou. In the black ocean formed by the beast tide, countless wild waves rose. That was the movement of tens of thousands of monsters looking at that sword will. The terrifying shadow in the sky became even lower, as if it was going to cover the entire grassland. In front of the main entrance of the mausoleum, Nank suddenly turned around and gazed into the depths of the plain. Her eyes narrowed, and her usual indifferent and even somewhat dull gaze became incomparably sharp. However, no matter if it was the tens of thousands of monsters or her, or even the shadow in the sky, They could only see the plain with a circumference of 10 li in the depths of the plain. They could not see the sword figure, because before this, a cool breeze had blown through the plain. The sword intent went with the wind and disappeared with the wind. It was silent, and in an instant it disappeared without a trace. No one sensed that the sword intent had followed the cool breeze, passed through the dusky plain, and entered the dark clouds. It ignored the rain falling from the sky and arrived in front of Zhou Dufu's mausoleum. Then, like the stamen of a wintersweet, it landed on the ground covered in thick snow. It was like the first stream of muddy water flowing from upstream flowing into a riverbed that had been dry for 1,000 years. Just like that, it disappeared into the mausoleum. Naturally, no one was able to discover where the sword intent had gone. Chen Chongqing's left hand held the umbrella at an angle. He did not block the rain, only guarding against Nank's attack. His entire body was already drenched by the rain. The rain gradually became heavier. The pearl-sized droplets of water constantly struck against the surface of the yellow paper umbrella, producing a drumming sound. The yellow paper umbrella began to tremble slightly. The trembling followed the surface and the ribs of the umbrella to the handle of the umbrella. Then, it clearly traveled to his hand, his body, and his heart. The sound of the rain gradually grew louder, but the high platform in front of the mausoleum seemed incomparably quiet. Nank turned around and looked at him expressionlessly. For some reason, she felt that this completely drenched and incomparably sorry-looking youth had become somewhat different from before. She did not know where this feeling came from, and how it was related to the change in the plain earlier. However, she knew that some things were about to change. She would not accept any change that would prevent her from entering the Grand Mausoleum, so she decided to end this battle before the change came. However, she did not think that the change had already occurred. That was not the sound of a torrential rain, but the sound of a pair of wings unfolding in the rain. The green wings, over 10 zhang in length, unfolded behind her, bringing out 2 streaks of rain. Under the dim light, the droplets of water were like droplets of blood, beautiful and soul-stirring. The green wings suddenly sped up, and a gale suddenly rose on the stone platform in front of the mausoleum's main entrance. The rain that fell from the sky all shot away, and a powerful qi directly shook all the rain back into the sky. Nank disappeared from the edge of the stone platform. In the next moment, she attacked Chen Chongqing with a few droplets of rain and an extremely cold, killing intent. Chen Chongqing's gaze passed through the rain and cold wind, and met with the little girl's gaze. All he saw was coldness and the determination to kill. In that instant, his eyelashes were frozen by the cold wind and killing intent to the point that they no longer trembled. The demon princess' terrifying attack with all her strength had actually made him think that he could not block it. He thought like this, but he could not do it because he wanted to live. As a result, he gripped the dagger and slashed at the rain and cold wind in front of him. However, in the instant he swung the dagger, he felt an extremely strange sensation, so much so that his arm became stiff. He did not have any confidence that this dagger could block Nank's attack with all her strength. However, for some reason, he felt that the dagger in his hand seemed to be very confident. The dagger pierced towards the cold wind and rain. The cold wind suddenly dispersed, and the cold rain immediately stopped. In just an instant, the edge of the dagger broke through the wind and rain, and arrived in front of Nank's forehead. The sword energy of this strike was not stable, and the heart of the sword was not clear, much less any sword move. However, the sword intent was incomparably powerful. I have nothing to do today. I will slowly and seriously write. I will write 9,000 characters before going to sleep, but not too quickly. Chapter 325. This strike indeed couldn't be considered a sword move. The sword momentum was also extremely unstable, and the heart of the sword was even more terrible, because as soon as the sword was unleashed, Chen Chongqing discovered the abnormality, and was suddenly at a loss. What kind of unforeseen event could cause someone as calm and mature as him to be unable to maintain his state of mind? The moment he drew his sword, he suddenly realized that this short sword that had accompanied him for a long time no longer belonged to him. It began to act on its own. The dagger slashed through the wind and rain, slashing towards Nank, who was behind the wind and rain. It seemed like a sword technique that he had completed with a swing of the dagger, but in reality, it had nothing to do with him. In his initial plan, he was prepared to use the most powerful attack of the true sword of the orthodoxy to deal with Nank's full-strength attack, but the dagger didn't listen to his will and use that sword technique. Instead, it just stabbed forward. This stab was extremely reckless and careless. If there were spectators of this battle, seeing Chen Changxing use this sword move, they would definitely think that he was seeking death. What was going on? There was a power in his body. No, it was not power, nor was it an aura. It was a feeling that was hard to describe with words. It made him hold the dagger and stab it towards the wind and rain in front of him. His movements were completely in accordance with that feeling. He was chasing after that feeling. His movements were very natural. The sword that pierced through the cold wind and cold rain was not straight. The sword's path was crooked and twisted. It looked like a line left by a child who had just learned to write on a piece of paper. It was impossible to see the move, and there was no hidden meaning. However, that feeling reached the depths of his heart and made him feel incomparably vivid. Just like the sword momentum, that feeling was the excitement of leaving the abyss, the ecstasy of seeing the clear sky. It was joy, it was incessantly jumping for joy. For some inexplicable reason, the short sword was trembling with excitement. How could such a sword pierce through the cold wind and rain? How could it directly block Nank's full-powered attack? How could it defeat this terrifyingly powerful demon princess? However, it was only for a moment. The dagger twisted and turned as it pierced forward, easily piercing through the wind and rain in front of him. Afterwards, it pierced right in front of Nank. On the stone platform in front of the main entrance of the mausoleum, there was a very soft ripping sound, as if something had been pierced. It was followed by a deafening hum, as if a huge bell was being hammered by countless strong men. A strong vibration occurred, and the air surged in all directions, swirling up countless dust and rain stains. Nank's furious howl rang out amidst the dust and rain and snow. Just like in the battle at the peak of Sunset Valley, her howl was still clear and bright, but compared to that night, her howl was no longer as steady, powerful, and confident. Instead, it was filled with pain, confusion, and shock. The powerful aura instantly shook off the dust and snow on the stone platform, clearing the area. Nank swiftly retreated. Her feet landed on the boundary between the stone platform and the divine path, producing a muffled bang. Several cracks appeared on the limestone there. A half-foot-long green feather, exuding a bewitching and beautiful feeling, slowly landed on the stone platform. Nank's small face was pale. She looked at Chen Changxing with eyes filled with flames of anger and a trace of subtle confusion. After a while, she withdrew her gaze and looked at a certain place on her dark green left wing. She saw that there was a sword wound there, and it was currently slowly seeping blood. The dim light from the sky in the distance shone through from there. It was quiet in front of the main entrance of the mausoleum. Probably because of the pain in her howl, Su Yorong had also woken up. Seeing the scene in front of her, she was slightly stunned and speechless. Nank looked at Chen Changxing again. Her gaze landed on the dagger in his right hand, and her pupils constricted slightly. She did not understand, why was this dagger so sharp? What sword style was this? Why had the sword intent become so strong? Chen Changxing also looked at the dagger in his hand. His expression was also somewhat confused. He had already spent over a year with the dagger that his senior had gifted him, but why did this dagger give him a somewhat unfamiliar feeling? He knew that this dagger possessed a sharpness that was not inferior to the divine weapons on the tier of legendary weapons, but why did this dagger possess such a strong sword intent? Yes, at this moment, he had already confirmed that the strong feeling from before was sword intent. The dagger followed that feeling, pursued that feeling. It seemed crooked and ugly, but in reality, it was incomparably natural, as if it was walking in the clouds, flowing in the water. Of course, this feeling was sword intent, and it could only be sword intent. It was just that this sword intent did not belong to him. Because the current him, even if he could achieve illumination of the sword heart, his cultivation was still not enough to cultivate such a powerful sword intent. Just where did this sword intent come from? If it was not the dagger's own sword intent, then when did it enter his body? The fingers on his hand that gripped the hilt were somewhat white. He thought with confusion and shock, could it be that this sword intent was the sword intent that the yellow paper umbrella had been searching for all this time? Was it the sword intent that had led him through the boundless plains to the mausoleum of Zhou? Didn't this sword intent disappear? When did it come? And why did it come? He had a greater understanding of this sword intent, so he thought even more. Nank did not need to think so much, so she woke up even faster than him. The shock and anger in her eyes completely dissipated, recovering their previous indifference and sluggishness. Without the slightest hesitation, she once again attacked him. She had vaguely guessed at something, and was prepared to use battle to prove whether or not her guesses were correct. As for whether or not she would be injured, that had never been something she cared about. The cold rain fell again, and the pair of wings that were over 10 zhang long stirred up a hurricane on the stone platform. The fierce wind rose again, turning the raindrops into pebbles that struck Qin Chongqing's face and body. A cry of a bird. A clang. Nank once again appeared in front of him. Her right hand gripped the Southern Cross sword, and she slashed at his forehead. This was the first time she had attacked. In other words, the current Qin Chongqing could finally become an opponent on the same level as Su Yorong in her eyes. If it were any other time, if it were those days before, if it were just a moment ago, it would have been very difficult for Qin Chongqing to receive this strike. Although his heart of the sword was illuminated, and his sword intent was flawless, his sword intent was much weaker than the terrifying sword intent that Nank had attached to the Southern Cross sword. But at this moment, he did not even think about it. He swung his sword. In reality, there was no need for him to think in the first place. That feeling appeared in his heart again. The sword in his hand was completely swung according to that feeling. It seemed to be played down, but it was actually indescribably profound. There was a huge boom in front of the main entrance of the mausoleum, and several extremely deep cracks appeared on the limestone floor. Nank's Southern Cross sword had been blocked by the dagger in his hand. Her Southern Cross sword had not even had the time to completely display its power before it was broken by the dagger in his hand. A sword ray surged out from the tip of the dagger. It was about 3 zhang long, as if it wanted to illuminate the entire mausoleum. The green wings suddenly curled back, protecting Nank's body. With a painful grunt, she quickly retreated once again. Her 2 feet landed on the edge of the stone platform, and another crack appeared on the limestone there. But this was still not enough. The extremely sharp blade directly pierced through her 2 wings, and pierced towards the center of her forehead. Her 2 wings flapped against the rain, and Nank leapt up, landing on the divine path. But this was still not enough. She leapt up again, and quickly retreated into the rainy sky behind her. It was still not enough. She had to retreat again and again and again. There was only a series of sounds of limestone shattering. Her 2 feet were like plows, dragging out 2 clear marks on the hard limestone of the divine path. Only after she had retreated several hundred zhang did she finally stop. Silence reigned. The dark clouds in the sky constantly sprinkled down cold rain, enveloping the entire mausoleum of Zhou. No matter if it was the stone platform or the divine path, they were all drenched. The sound of the falling rain seemed to have disappeared. A streak of blood slowly flowed from the corner of Nank's lips, which was quickly washed away by the increasingly heavy cold rain. Qin Chongqing looked at the dagger in his hand, and felt the incomparably powerful sword intent. He did not know what to think. In reality, the sword intent was not in the yellow paper umbrella, nor was it in the dagger. It was in his body, because the person that the sword intent wanted to help was him. He raised his head, and walked to the boundary between the stone platform and the divine path. He gazed at Nank in the rain 100 jong away and said, "Right now, it seems like I can defeat you." The rain flowed down Nank's pale little face, and dripped down from her wet black hair. She looked rather pitiful, but her expression was still cold and arrogant. Looking down from above, it was impossible to tell that she had just lost 2 blows in succession, and had no leeway to counterattack. Her voice was also similarly cold. "This isn't your sword intent at all." Chen Chongqing was quiet for a while, then asked, "So?" Nank expressionlessly said, "Even if I lose to this sword intent. What does it have to do with you?" Yes, this sword intent could not possibly belong to Chen Chongqing. No matter if it was her who was fighting against Chen Chongqing, or the pair of powerful demon generals who were watching from below the divine path, or the zither-playing old man, or even Su Yorong who had just opened her eyes and saw this scene, they were all extremely clear on this point. The sword intent was too sharp, and completely did not match the path that Chen Chongqing cultivated. Most importantly, this sword intent was too strong. This kind of strength that could even make up for the difference in true essence was something that could not be tempered with time. To cultivate this kind of sword intent required at least several hundred years of seeking the path of the sword. He was only 15. No matter how much of a genius he was in the path of the sword, he could not achieve this. No one could do it, not even the demons. Even if Zhou Dufu were to live again, he could not do it. "Yes, this isn't my sword intent." Chen Chongqing gazed at the boundless plain behind the monster tide that was like a black ocean below the mausoleum, then looked at Nank and said, "But this sword intent has come to find me, and is willing to be used by me. This proves that I have the qualifications to use it, so it is my sword intent." Nank asked, "This sword intent, just where did it come from?" Chen Chongqing looked into her eyes and said honestly, "You should have guessed it already." Around the mausoleum, up and down the divine path, there was silence because of shock. Although it was just as Chen Chongqing had said, Nank had already guessed the truth of the matter, she still could not believe it, and was very unwilling to accept it. The torrential rain poured down, and the damp cold pierced the bone. Her voice was rather hoarse. "Sword pool? I'm talking about the sword will, and also about Nank jumping on the divine path. I've finished the 2nd chapter today, but I can't feel excited. I have to continue writing. The 3rd chapter will definitely be very, 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 very late. Fortunately, it's the weekend, so everyone doesn't have to go to work tomorrow. Ho ho! Thinking that I have to go to work tomorrow, I suddenly feel so sad." Chapter 326. The fact that the sword pool was in the garden of Zhou was a legend. At the same time, it was also the conjecture of many people for many years. From Zhou Dufu's sudden appearance over 1,000 years ago to his quiet departure several hundred years ago, this exceptional genius who loved to battle had issued countless challenges to the experts of the continent. His unimaginable strength had, to a large extent, been constantly raised through these battles. On his path to the title of the number 1 expert under the starry sky, countless people had been defeated by the Having Blade. In the Battle of Luoyang, he had defeated Emperor Taizong in front of the heroes of the world and the countless experts of the Great Zhou. Outside Xuelao City, he had defeated the Demon Lord in front of countless demon experts. In the Mausoleum of Books, he had defeated the Pope. At the source of the Red River, he had defeated the White Emperor, and many, many more. It could even be said that if one were to look at the several hundred years of history, as long as one was a true expert, they would all have been defeated by him. In reality, besides the legendary battles mentioned above, even more of the so-called world-shaking battles did not occur in the human world, but in the Garden of Zhou. The Garden of Zhou was Zhou Dufu's miniature world. In this battle, he had many conveniences, and could even play tricks. This seemed very unfair, but his opponents did not have any objections, because he was Zhou Dufu. He disdained doing such things, and there was no need for him to do so. He just did not want those mediocre people to see him fight. His opponents naturally did not want the world to see them lose, so those battles occurred in the Garden of Zhou. There were no spectators, and there were no recorders. Other than the participants, no one knew the specific details of the battles. They only knew the final outcome, which was nothing new. Countless experts had been defeated by his blade. Some died, some lived, but their swords were all left in the Garden of Zhou, left behind by the second-ranked having blade on the tier of legendary weapons. Those swords were definitely not ordinary, and many of them were even divine weapons on the tier of legendary weapons. For example, the Dragoncry sword on the waist of a certain prince of the great Zhou imperial family, or the famous sword called Heaven Shrouding, which was in existence in the top 10 of the tier of legendary weapons. It was said that these famous swords that were left in the Garden of Zhou had all been thrown into a mountain pool by Zhou Dufu. That mountain pool was the legendary sword pool. If the sword pool really did exist, then it was a monument that Zhou Dufu had erected for himself. The famous swords in the pool were his achievements and glory. All the cultivators that were able to enter the Garden of Zhou wanted to find the sword pool the most. Zhou Dufu's legacy might be difficult to find, but any one of the swords in the sword pool was a divine weapon that could greatly increase a cultivator's battle prowess. Moreover, if they could inherit the legacy of those experts from back then through those swords, what would that signify? How could they not be infatuated? However, no one had ever found the sword pool. No one had even found a sword in the Garden of Zhou. On the contrary, this proved the rumors of the sword pool. Those famous swords that had disappeared were assuredly hidden in some place in the Garden of Zhou. With the passage of time, the sword pool became more and more mysterious. Its position in the hearts of cultivators grew more and more majestic, even surpassing the Garden of Zhou itself and becoming a true legend of the cultivation world. However, had no one really ever found a sword in the Garden of Zhou? Then why was it that after Qi Jian and Liang Xiaoxiao entered the Garden of Zhou, they did not hesitate to follow the stream upstream? Why did Zhuang Huanyu also go there? Why was Chen Chongqing able to sense that sword intent by the cold pool? Why was the demon race's assassins waiting for them there? Whether it was in the human world or the demon realm, there were already many powers that had vaguely discovered some information about the sword pool. Perhaps it was because someone had picked up an ancient sword sheath in the forest by the stream many years ago? No, the true reason was because several hundred years ago, a peerless genius of the Mountly sword sect had once picked up a sword from the cold pool at the end of the stream. That peerless genius of the Mountly sword sect was called Su Li. However, just where was the sword pool? The cold pool led to the large lake on the other side of the cliff, and the large lake on the other side led to the small lake near the plains in front of Sunset Valley. However, there were no swords in either the pool or the lake. If one simply and crudely linked all these clues together, connecting these dots into a line, one could see that this line pointed to the depths of the plains. Then did this not mean that the legendary sword pool was in the plains? In reality, this had always been the conclusion of the vast majority of cultivators. The footprints of the human cultivators and the demons had already covered the entire Garden of Zhou. After several hundred years, they still had not found the sword pool. Then the greatest possibility was that the sword pool was hidden in the plains, because only the plains had not been explored. It was a pity that this conclusion could never be verified. All the people that entered the plains of the unsetting sun were unable to return. So those that had not entered the plains of the unsetting sun would never be able to see the true scene of the plains. Fortunately, or perhaps unluckily, Chen Chongqing and Su Yorong had entered the plains. They could see the truth, although they could not necessarily send the true information back to the human world outside the Garden of Zhou. The sword intent continued to guide them deeper into the plains, as if it wanted to bring them to see the truth. However, they saw Zhou Dufu's mausoleum, but they still did not see any traces of the sword pool. Right now, the sword intent was in his body. He was sure that the sword intent definitely came from the sword pool. However, he did not know which famed sword this sword intent belonged to several hundred years ago, which famous person it belonged to. The rain grew heavier and heavier, and as a result, the wind passing through the mausoleum gradually grew more violent. The few green leaves that had fallen from Su Yorong's wudong tree, which had previously been shaken to the bottom of the huge boulder by the qi and stuck to the rain and snow, were now actually swept up by the wind. The green leaves were swept up by the wind and rolled along the ground, arriving at Chen Chongqing's feet. Then, they floated up and touched a corner of his clothes. Swish, swish. A sharp sound rang out. In that instant it actually drowned out the sound of the wind and rain. The green leaf was cut into countless threads by the invisible sword intent. Just as it was about to fly, it was blown away by the wind and rain. On the divine avenue several hundred zhang away, Nank's rain-drenched face seemed to become even paler. This scene made her even more vigilant and uneasy, because she had never seen such a powerful sword intent. Yes, at this moment, she silently thought of the word never. Her teacher Blackrobe did not use the sword, her father the Demon Lord did not use the sword, and the Demon Commander did not use the sword either. However, there were still countless demon experts that used the sword, yet she still had never seen such a powerful sword intent. This was only a strand of sword intent, yet it was already so sharp. If the body of the sword was still here, just how terrifying would it be? Several hundred years ago, just which peerless expert was the master of this sword intent to actually cultivate the way of the sword to such a level? The rainwater fell on the blade of the dagger, emitting a pitter-patter, washing away the bloodstains on it. It was bright like a mirror. Chen Chongqing looked at this dagger, his eyes also bright like a mirror. In the 3,000 scriptures there were countless explanations for sword intent, but only one explanation was accepted by the orthodox orthodoxy. Sword intent was sword sense. Sword sense was not the sword's divine sense, nor was it the sword's intelligence, nor was it a living spiritual object. It was the remnant of information left on the sword by the user's battle awareness and experience after a long period of accumulation. To use a more understandable, but inaccurate explanation, sword sense was the knowledge of the sword. Sword sense was the remnant of information, or the essence of information, the crystallization of battle awareness, but it was not a concrete and objective existence. It could not be calculated, nor could it be simulated. When it entered the human mind, it was only a feeling. At this moment, he was feeling this feeling. From this sword intent, he felt absolute confidence, supreme sharpness, disdain towards the heaven and earth. He felt this sword intense conflict and even hatred towards this grassland, and he felt a strong desire for freedom. Of course, the strongest feeling was joy, a joyful joy. At the beginning, the user of the sword was no longer here, but the sword was still here, but later on, the sword was also gone, and only the sword intent remained. This sword intent could not leave this grassland. It was trapped here, or perhaps imprisoned here, for a long time. For several hundred years, it never stopped thinking about leaving. Now that it found the possibility of leaving, it came to meet Chen Chongqing, like a bird that was about to be released from its cage. However, he did not know that this sword-intense ecstasy, other than the possibility of leaving, was also the joy of meeting with an old friend. The massive and terrifying shadow occupied half of the sky, while the other half was filled with dark clouds. It was already night, and the ball of light at the edge of the grassland was dim. In the torrential rain, the mausoleum of Zhou became even deeper and pitch-black, like a massive black mountain. If Chen Chongqing was not currently in the Black Mountain, he would definitely associate it with the massive black nightmare sarcophagus in the mausoleum. Let's leave together. Chen Chongqing turned around and glanced at Su Yorong, then said to the sword intent. He looked at the divine path in the torrential rain, at Nank. Nank looked at the Southern Cross sword in her hand. There was a clear chip on the blade, the result of the two swords clashing. This sword was obviously extraordinary, a famous sword on the tier of legendary weapons, but it was not as sharp as the ordinary and unremarkable dagger in Chen Chongqing's hand. Every sword has its own strongest point. She awoke from the shock brought about by the sword intent and the sword pool, and understood many things. Raising her head to look at Chen Chongqing at the end of the divine path, her expression once again becoming cold and indifferent. So what? That sword intent really is very powerful, but in the end it was still defeated by the having blade. Do you think that you can defeat me by relying on this sword intent? Or do you hope that you can use this sword intent to leave the garden of Zhou? She looked at Chen Chongqing and said this, then opened her arms. The clear light illuminated the mausoleum in the torrential rain. Her two wings transformed into streams of light and disappeared. The two maids, Hua Chui and Ning Qiu, knelt in the rain behind her. They lowered their heads, not daring to speak. It could only be vaguely seen that their faces were pale. They had probably been heavily injured by the sword intent earlier. The body of this sword intent has probably already become scrap metal, or even ash, which is why it can leave the sword pool. The body of the sword is gone, and a sword intent that can only be consumed and cannot be replenished. How long can you rely on it to last? Not to mention that sword intent is sword consciousness. With your current level of cultivation, it's impossible for you to comprehend this kind of sword consciousness. You don't know sword styles, so you probably won't even be able to display 1,000th of its power. Since that's the case, on what basis do you say that you can defeat me? In the torrential rain, along with the voice that still retained its childishness, Nank's sword energy slowly but steadily increased, and her chi became more and more berserk. Chen Chongqing knew that she was not bluffing. If the cultivation of the swordsman was strong enough, then no matter if they were meditating or fighting, they would be tempering their sword intent at every moment. However, if the level of the sword intent was even higher than the swordsman's, then the sword intent would be constantly consumed in battle, and could not be replenished. Most importantly, my sword intent is inferior to yours, so why should I compete with you in terms of sword intent? With that, Nank raised the Southern Cross sword. She still stood 300 meters away, a very large distance away from Chen Chongqing. She had already retracted her wings, and it did not seem like she was trying to close the distance between them. The most important change was that this time, she was using two hands to raise the sword. Her body was very petite, even thin. The Southern Cross sword was very wide, long, and straight. She was using her two small hands to raise it into the air. The scene was rather strange, just like a child preparing to play with a large metal hammer. The contrast was extremely clear. Seeing this scene, Chen Chongqing instantly guessed how she would attack, and understood that he had made a huge mistake. Since his greatest support was this powerful sword intent, then he should not let her be too far away from him. Different swords had different strengths, and each sword had many different aspects. Sword intent was only a part of the sword. Other than that, there was also the sword energy and the amount of true essence attached to the sword. These were all important components that were no less important than sword intent. Nank's attack relied on the influence of distance on sword intent, forcing him to use sword energy and strength to fight. A sword glow illuminated the dusky sky and the mausoleum in the torrential rain. A dark blue sword glow separated from the blade of the Southern Cross sword. Like a meteor with a fiery tail, it slashed towards Chen Chongqing at the end of the divine path. Chen Chongqing's fingers that gripped the sword hilt were slightly white, and his lips were also slightly white. He did not know if it was because of his injuries or because the rain was too cold. A weak, but abnormally certain voice rang out from behind him, "Use the umbrella." The one who thought of the method was not that sword intent. Sword intent could not speak. The one who spoke was Su Yorong. Chen Chongqing did not understand why she would say such a thing, but along the way, he knew that her cultivation and strength, especially her insight, far surpassed his. Most importantly, he trusted her very much. So without any hesitation, without any thought, he raised the yellow paper umbrella. With his action, the sword intent entered the yellow paper umbrella. It was not entering, but returning. He did not understand why he had such a feeling, but he felt that this represented the true return of the sword intent. Even the entire world could feel the return of the sword intent. The grassland became extremely quiet. The beast tide surged, and countless demonic beasts let out roars of fear, unease, or rage. Even the terrifying shadow in the sky seemed to have faded a little at that moment. It's been a long time since I've written so hard. I'm not used to it. I'll work hard tomorrow. It definitely won't be so late. Then there's that guy from the White Crane in the Heavens, Invincible Spirit Summoning mobile game. It's on the Apple Store, and even more despicable is Angelababy's endorsement. Students who like games should go support it. Chapter 327. When the sword intent entered the yellow paper umbrella, the surrounding world of the mausoleum reacted. However, the first thing to change was obviously the yellow paper umbrella itself. The yellow paper umbrella was still the same as usual, old and slightly dirty. Its outer appearance hadn't changed at all, but the chi it emitted had changed greatly. In the hands of this umbrella-shaped artifact that had an extremely strong defense, it seemed as if it had suddenly become an incomparably sharp sword. In Chen Chongqing's eyes, it was clearly still an umbrella, but in his hands, he could clearly feel the feeling of a sword. The dark blue sword glow arrived, carrying Nank's absolute killing intent and incomparably powerful true essence. Chen Chongqing raised the yellow paper umbrella to receive it. It was like he was holding a round shield, attempting to block the enemy's spear. Several dozen days ago, on the lakeside of the cliff in the Garden of Zhou, when he battled with the two maids, he often used this method. However, it was very clear that the yellow paper umbrella today was very different from the yellow paper umbrella from that day. Was it because of that sword intent? However, this was completely different from the sword intent he displayed with the dagger before. It was a completely different concept. The difference was that the yellow paper umbrella that possessed that sword intent had become incomparably powerful, and even somewhat terrifying. On the stone platform in front of the mausoleum's main entrance, countless sharp cutting sounds suddenly rang out. Those sounds were like cracks in space, but also like turbulence in the air. They were rapid and short, but they were continuous and unending. Countless seemingly fine sword gusts surged out from the yellow paper umbrella's surface. They revolved around his body at high speeds, slicing through everything they encountered. The snow and rain, the cliff path, and the dark blue sword glow. The raindrops that fell from the sky were sliced into powder. The snow that had accumulated on the ground was sliced into threads. On the hard ground, the stone walls, and even the main entrance of the mausoleum, countless deep sword marks appeared. As for the dark blue sword glow that came through the air, before it could even illuminate the 2 stars of the Southern Cross, it was sliced into 10,000 streaks of starlight, dispersing along with the shattered threads of wind. The sharp cutting sounds gradually became lower, then disappeared. Those fine sword gusts gradually returned to the stone cliffs of the mausoleum, never to appear again. The torrential rain continued to fall, but compared to before, it seemed to have become much more timid, especially the rain that fell on the yellow paper umbrella. It was quiet. On the other hand, the plains below the mausoleum gradually became noisy. The monster tide that was like a black sea vaguely stirred up waves, showing signs of unrest. Previously, when this strand of sword intent had entered Chen Chongqing's body and was displayed by his dagger, the monster tide was still able to remain calm. However, when this strand of sword intent had entered the yellow paper umbrella and then easily shattered Nank's sword energy, thus proving a few things. The tens of thousands of monsters in the plains could no longer control their emotions. Some monsters fearfully and uneasily attempted to retreat, but even more monsters let out angry roars towards the mausoleum. Countless angry roars converged together like thunder, about to tear apart the gloomy sky. If Nank had not used the soul wood to forcefully suppress it, the black ocean formed by the monster tide would have already surged towards the mausoleum of Zhou. Nank did not know why the demonic beasts were reacting so strongly. Was it because the appearance of that sword intent indicated that the sword pool was about to appear? Then why was the beast tide not as turbulent as it was now when the sword intent appeared? She was puzzled. Her gaze passed through the rain and landed on Su Yorong. Previously, it was precisely her that made Chen Chongqing abandon the sword and use the umbrella. Today, everyone present was an expert. Su Yorong had not recovered from her heavy injuries and was extremely weak. She spent the majority of the time with her eyes closed, not watching the battle. However, she had actually understood something. This made Nank somewhat angry and unwilling. It was just like how she felt when Chen Chongqing used that strand of sword intent. Here, she still had to quote Tang 36's famous judgment. Su Yorong and Chen Chongqing were really two fellows that were very good at making people speechless. Su Yorong braced herself and looked at the restless monster tied below the mausoleum. She said weakly, "Close the umbrella." Chen Chongqing listened to her and closed the yellow paper umbrella. After the umbrella was closed, it was very much like a sword. Many people had similar experiences. After the rain stopped, they would use the tip of the umbrella to stab at the mud and walls for fun. Why? Because after the umbrella was closed, it was very much like a sword. At this moment, the yellow paper umbrella that Chen Chongqing held in his left hand was very much like a sword. The monster tied around the mausoleum instantly became silent. Those angry roars disappeared just like that. The monsters that were in an uproar and attempting to head towards the mausoleum became somewhat fearful and uneasy, as if something big was about to happen. In the depths of the monster tide, the powerful star condensation monsters that were like mountains and rivers began to emit a ruthless and bloody chi. The huge shadow in the sky became even lower than before. The sword pool was the greatest secret of the Garden of Zhou. The sword was the greatest taboo of the plains. Just what was the connection between this sword intent and the sword pool that it represented and the countless monsters that ran amok in the plains of the unsetting sun? Su Yorong silently deduced and calculated. Her mental energy was quickly consumed, and her face became paler and paler. Finally, her gaze fell on the umbrella in Chen Chongqing's left hand. She thought to herself, "It seems like this really is the legendary yellow paper umbrella." In the world outside the Garden of Zhou, the wind and snow remained the same. The huge shadow in the sky became even lower than before. In the distance of the snowy plains, the figures of over 10 demon generals towered like mountains and rivers, emitting a bloody and powerful chi. So far, 1 demon general had already died in battle, 7 demon generals were injured, and 3 of them had their limbs severed. The demons had already paid a heavy enough price. The snowflakes landed on Su Li's shoulders and were instantly cut into countless pieces. There was blood on his sword, but there was no blood on his body. He seemed uninjured, but in reality, he had already consumed a great deal of energy. He could no longer perfectly condense his sword intent in his body, and it began to leak out. Black Robe sat cross-legged on a snowy hill and calmly said to him, "Although you are called Su Li, you cannot leave today." Su Li looked at the shadow in the sky and said nothing. "What do you like to eat the most? What do you dislike to eat the most? Where have you been these past few years? How many people have you killed in the great western continent? Do you like mountains or the sea? How often do you write a letter to your daughter? How long did you take to master the first sword move after you entered the Mountly Sword sect? How many times did you quarrel with your master? How many days did you cry after your master died in the Garden of Zhou?" Black Robe used his slender fingers to lightly stroke the square plate in front of his knees, and said, "All the information I could gather related to you was used in this situation. How could you possibly leave?" Su withdrew his gaze and looked at him mockingly. "The people I dislike the most are people like you. You clearly still have to rely on strength to fight to the death in the end, but you always like to talk about reason and probability. Even when you're about to die and on your last breath, you still don't forget to put on an appearance of having the pearl of wisdom in your hand. Who are you acting for?" A low laugh came from Black Robe. "Naturally, it's for people like you who have been calculated to death by me." Su sneered. "Do you really think that everything can be calculated?" Black Robe asked. "Why not? Of course you know that the stars can move. Since the stars can move, how can there be an unchanging fate? If it is not predestined, how can it be calculated?" Su gazed at the night sky. He did not see the river formed by the two stars in the south, only the snowflakes that constantly fell in front of that shadow. He said in a clear voice, "Everything in the world is changing at every moment. The longer the snow falls, the thicker it becomes. Perhaps there will be a moment when an avalanche will occur. How can you calculate that? The path of the sword is not snow, and cultivation is not falling snow. Quantitative changes do not necessarily lead to qualitative changes, and desperate situations cannot help you break through." Black Robe knew what his words of snow implied. He calmly said, "Because you are an unparalleled genius of the path of the sword." These words were praise. Coming from the mouth of the continent's most mysterious demon military advisor, even Su should feel proud. But these words were even more offensive. If an unparalleled genius of the path of the sword could break through, he would have broken through long ago, whether it was through the great terror between life and death or some other method. Black Robe continued, "You are unable to make the path of the sword reach perfection not because of any other reason. Talent, comprehension, willpower, and even the most crucial of luck, you have never lacked any of these. The reason it is like this is because you lack the most important thing. That thing is of the utmost importance to the path of the sword." Su naturally understood what he was talking about. The path of the sword is the cultivation of the sword. Black Robe's voice did not fluctuate in the slightest as he coldly concluded, "Without a sword that is worthy of you, your path of the sword will never be complete." The next chapter will be a little later, but it should be out before 11. Chapter 328. The path of the sword obviously cultivated the sword. Of course the sword was important. Only was it really that important? Other than affecting battle prowess, could it really turn around and affect the cultivation of the user? The sword in Su hand came from the smithy in that small town at the base of Mount Lee. It was personally forged by the not-so-famous smithy, Luo Dagon. It had cost him a lot of silver and taken half a day. It had already been with him for more than 20 years. Holding this ordinary longsword that could not be called a divine weapon no matter how one looked at it, he was still the world's #1 in the path of the sword. Before the edge of his sword, anyone who blocked it would be forced to retreat. Not too long ago, he had even beheaded a demon general. It was also precisely because of this ordinary sword that the Mount Lee sword sect's attitude towards swords that returned to their natural state became the norm. The divine state's 7 laws and the other young disciples, out of admiration for their junior martial granduncle, all followed suit. Qiushan Jun clearly possessed the extremely famous dragon scale sword, but when he traversed the continent and even fought with the demon experts for the key to the Garden of Zhou, he was only willing to use an ordinary longsword. That sword also came from that small town at the base of Mount Lee, also came from that smithy, and also only cost a few silver coins. Guan Feibai was also like this. However, this did not affect the status of Qiushan Jun and Guan Feibai in the younger generation of experts of the continent. Holding ordinary steel swords, they were also people of the divine state's laws. Some foolish and stubborn people might not understand this point. Black Robe gently wiped away a few snowflakes on the square plate and calmly said to Suli, "But I understand that as long as you can't find that sword, then whether it's the killing autumn in Scolatry Manor or the inferior sword in your hand from the smithy, it doesn't make any difference to you. Yes." Suli was silent for a while, then said, "I really am lacking a sword, and I've always been searching for that sword." Many years ago, he had been brought from his hometown to Mountly by his master. After traversing several dozen li of mountain paths, he entered the sect and became an inner disciple of the Mountly sword sect. He used a very short amount of time to grasp the secrets of the Mountly sword sect, and his talent in the path of the sword gradually revealed itself. He received the love of all his senior brothers and sisters and the reverence of his martial nephews. However, he never had his own sword. When the Crimson Rock Peaks training hall was divided into swords, he did not choose one. Every day when he practiced with the sword and when he practiced with his senior brothers, he used a wooden sword. His senior brothers asked him why he did not want to choose a sword, and he said that he did not like the swords in the training hall. In fact, he had another thought in his heart. Those swords did not like him either, and they all avoided him. An entire year had passed, and he had completed the study of the basic sword technique. He had a basic understanding of the true meaning of the sword, and he was finally qualified to enter the peak and enter his master's abode. His master was the sect master of the Mountly sword sect, a peerless expert of the sword publicly acknowledged by the entire continent. But he did not listen to what his master was saying at all. He only looked at the sword hanging on the wall behind his master. The sheath of the sword was pitch black, made of some unknown material. The sword was in the sheath, and its true appearance could not be seen, but for some reason, when he looked at the sword, he became happy, and wanted to dance with joy. He wanted to take it, hold it in his bosom, hug it to sleep, or even bathe. What made him even happier was that the sword in the sheath emitted a pleasant and gentle hum, as if it was responding to his joy and simultaneously expressing its own goodwill. At the time, Suli naturally did not know that this sword was the sword of the sect master of the Mountly sword sect, the famed heaven-shrouding sword ranked in the top 10 of the tier of legendary weapons. The sect master of the Mountly sword sect was rather flabbergasted. His sword was a peerless and vicious sword, incomparably sharp, extremely cold, and most capable of severing all emotions. Why did it emit such a gentle sword hum today, and why was it so gentle to this little boy? What did this mean? Then he began to laugh. Because Suli was his only disciple, it was only natural that this sword be passed down in the future. Now it seemed that man and sword never grew tired of each other, which was truly excellent. On that day, Suli received a promise from his master that this sword would be passed down to him in the future. This made him extremely happy, so much so that when his master spanked him for breaking the sect rules 37 times in the past year and made him copy the sword manual 500 times, he did not, in a rare instance, talk back. And then his master entered the garden of Zhou. And then there was no then. His master never came back. That sword also never returned. Suli cried for 3 days and 3 nights at the peak of Mountly, and then went into a daze for 7 days and 7 nights. Only then did he wake up and once again immerse himself in cultivating the path of the sword. However, this time, his senior brothers and sisters realized that there was an extra sword at his waist. That sword came from the small town at the foot of Mountly, from that unremarkable smithy. It came from the hands of an unfamous blacksmith at the time, the grandfather of the current blacksmith, Luo Dagon. Spring passed and autumn came. The years gradually passed. Suli's path of the sword had just begun, and he left Mountly for the Garden of Zhou. In the following decades, he would enter the Garden of Zhou once every 10 years. This naturally also meant that in those decades, the control of the Garden of Zhou was always in the hands of humans. The demons were never able to encroach upon it. The reason for this was because he wanted to enter the Garden of Zhou. who could steal the key to the Garden of Zhou from under his sword. He had two goals in entering the Garden of Zhou. First, he wanted to confirm whether Zhou Dufu was dead or alive. If the number one expert under the starry sky was already dead, then everything would naturally be over. If he was still alive, he wanted to know just how great the gap between them was, and how much time he, who was at the upper level of ethereal opening, needed to defeat this person. Secondly, he wanted to find that sword that had disappeared in the Garden of Zhou. Perhaps the starry sky had never let anyone down, or perhaps the famous sword that shrouded the heavens felt his longing, but when he entered the Garden of Zhou for the last time, Su Li actually found it in the forest by the stream. At the same time, this sword also became the first and only sword that had been found since the opening of the Garden of Zhou. However, the sword intent of the sword had already completely disappeared, leaving only the body of the sword. Although the material of the sword was still a rare and precious treasure that was hard to find in the world, it was no longer the sword of the past. The famous sword was the same as before, only the elegance was no longer there. Su Li stood by the stream in silence for a very long time, before finally accepting this fact. The sword was still there, but the sword intent was no longer there. It turned out that his master really was no longer there. Bringing the sword that had already lost its soul, Su Li left the Garden of Zhou and went to the distant Wenshui Tangs. He found the Tang Old Master who would occasionally personally take action, hoping that he could think of a way to revive the sword. What sort of status did the Tang Old Master have? How could he care about the almost idiotic request of a second-generation disciple of the Mount Li sword sect? Su Li only did one thing. He stood on the stone dam hidden deep in the mountains of the Wenshui Tangs. In a single night, he broke through several realms from the upper level of ethereal opening to the peak of star condensation. As the wealthiest person on the continent, the Tang Old Master was most skilled at recognizing goods. He knew that Su Li was displaying his value to him, and he admitted that Su Li definitely had this value. As a result, he changed his mind without hesitation and began to purchase precious materials from all over the place, attempting to revive the famous sword according to Su Li's request. Regretfully, not even the Wenshui Tangs were able to completely fulfill Su Li's request. His recollection ended here. Because of what happened afterwards, even he, who was always the most free and unrestrained, or perhaps the most thick-skinned, still felt rather embarrassed. He gazed at the shadow in the night sky and sensed the demon lord's unfathomable will. With a slight sneer, he thought, if that sword could come back to life, and I'm holding it in my hand, what do you have to say about it? The shadow in the sky grew lower and lower, as if it wanted to connect with the distant plains. Chen Chongqing gripped the yellow paper umbrella and looked at this scene, as well as the cold and deathly stillness in the eyes of those terrifying monsters in the monster tide. He did not know why. He did not know that the shadow in the sky was the projection of the Great Ping. He did not know that this Great Ping that was already half a step into the divine domain was Zhou Dufu's mount. He also did not know that the sword intent returning to the yellow paper umbrella meant that the sword pool could appear at any time. To that terrifying Great Ping, this was a great provocation. Nank's black hair draped over her shoulders. It was soaked by the rain and appeared extremely messy. Her small face was pale and the indifference in her eyes had long since been replaced by anger. In the previous exchange, even though they were separated by over 100 zhang, that swift and fierce sword intent had still injured her. She did not understand why the sword intent would become so terrifying after entering the yellow paper umbrella. So what if your sword intent is powerful? You don't understand sword styles. How long can you last with just sword intent? Hearing the voice of this little demon girl, Chen Chongqing originally wanted to say something, but in the end, he did not. He had no way of solving this problem, and in reality, even if he solved the problem of the sword intent not being able to be consumed endlessly, He still had no way of solving the monster tide that was like an ocean around the mausoleum. With a clear, angry cry, a cold wind suddenly rose on the divine path. The heavy and wet skirt fluttered and the rainwater shifted. Nank raised her sword and slashed again. 2 sword glows shot out from the edge of the Southern Cross sword. Like 2 rivers of stars, they followed the perfectly straight divine path and slashed towards Chen Chongqing. Chen Chongqing raised the yellow paper umbrella to meet them. Several hundred tiny sword gusts appeared on the surface of the umbrella, accompanied by the densely packed sounds of cutting. The unimaginably swift and fierce sword intent directly cut apart the 2 rivers of stars, and then instantly chopped them into countless pieces. The stone platform in front of the main entrance of the mausoleum was filled with specks of starlight, floating like a sea of fireflies. Just at this moment, the sound of a zither rang out. The ground at the bottom of the divine path had long been soaked by the torrential rain. The old man sat cross-legged in the rain, with the zither placed horizontally in front of his knees. He lowered his head and concentrated on playing a tune. The old man was an elder of the Candle Shadow Shamans, and he was most proficient in spiritual attacks. The zither sounds that seemed like gurgling water hid many dangers. The rain fell from the sky, and along with the tapping of his old fingers, they plucked the zither strings. Then, they were shaken into a mist by the vibrations of the zither strings. Accompanied by the clanging or gentle zither sounds, a few objects faintly appeared in the mist. Those were not real objects, but powerful spiritual wills. They were like mountain ghosts or like shamanic tigers. They suddenly left the zither on the old man's knees, and like a hurricane, they arrived on the stone platform. They did not blow away the specks of starlight that were like a sea of fireflies, but they very strangely avoided the yellow paper umbrella. They turned into several gusts of cold wind, and landed on Chen Chongqing's face. At this critical moment I did not hesitate to write about this famed sword that had disappeared. Everyone should understand the reason. From the very beginning, this large article in the Garden of Zhou was to rely on this sword to add luster to me. I hope that the final result will satisfy me and everyone else. I wish everyone a happy weekend. See you tomorrow. Also, the update was later than expected. Although it was still before 11, the reason for this is because I ate hot pot at night. I don't know if it was because I ate too much or some other reason, but I felt very uncomfortable and annoyed. Fine, I guess I ate too much. Chapter 329. The wind was a little cold, piercing his face with a slight pain. However, it was just a cold wind, not a spiritual attack from the zither-playing elder. Those misty thoughts that were like mountain ghosts and shaman tigers seemed to have avoided the yellow paper umbrella, but how could they actually avoid it? The yellow paper umbrella in Chen Chongqing's hands was made from countless precious materials of the Wenshui Tangs. It was personally forged by the old master of the Tang clan. If the umbrella wielder's cultivation was high enough, he could completely block out all spiritual attacks. Even if his current cultivation was not high enough, it was still enough to block out Black Robe's inspection from outside the Garden of Zhou. What could the mental attack of the zither-playing old man amount to? However, the zither-playing old man's attack represented a dangerous signal. This meant that Nank was finally no longer maintaining her pride. It was highly likely that the demon experts would attack together and surround him. This fact made Chen Chongqing very vigilant. Ting Xiaoming and Lu Wan'er, this demon general couple, had always quietly and silently stood at the bottom of the divine path. They were just as low-key as their names were, but he had never forgotten the terrifying strength that this demon general couple had displayed by the lake on the other side of the cliff. In reality, this demon general couple were both true experts at the upper level of star condensation. Besides the 5 saints, the storms of the 8 directions, and peerless experts like Su Li, who could say that they could easily defeat them. For the sake of entering the Garden of Zhou, the demon general couple had forcefully lowered their cultivation, only retaining the strength of the upper level of ethereal opening. However, with their battle experience and awareness, in terms of battle prowess, it was extremely possible that they were even stronger than Nang. Nang's sword energy had not been completely shattered by his sword intent. The starlight that was like a sea of fireflies still resolutely danced in front of the yellow paper umbrella. His gaze passed over the edge of the yellow paper umbrella and Nang's shoulder, falling below the divine path. His expression suddenly turned cold. He saw that in the wind and rain, Lu Wan was looking at him with a smile. She seemed very gentle and quiet, like a mother leaning against the door waiting for her son's return. However, the middle-aged man with a simple and honest face was nowhere to be seen. Where did he go? All of a sudden, the sky above the spirit path resounded with an explosive sound like spring thunder. The cold wind blowing through the mausoleum seemed to freeze in that instant, but the falling rain became even more violent. Chen Chongqing looked up and saw a black dot appear in the gloomy sky. The black dot fell with the torrential rain, faster and faster. In a very short period of time, it had become countless times bigger, and in his eyes it was like a mountain. The 24th demon general Ting Xiaoming had transformed into a heavy mountain peak. In his hands, he grasped a seemingly ordinary carrying pole. He condensed the wind and urged the rain to descend from the sky, whistling through the air with an incomparably berserk momentum. Seeing this scene, Chen Chongqing's face instantly paled, but his eyes were still as calm as before, without the slightest fear. The short sword in his right hand pierced through the curtain of rain and moved forward. The yellow paper umbrella in his left hand was currently blocking Nang's 2 rivers of stars, as well as the full-powered pounce of the Wu Hu from the zither. It was impossible for him to move. If he wanted to use the yellow paper umbrella to block Ting Xiaoming's heavy blow, then he could only hide in the yellow paper umbrella. However, if he did that, he would have no way out and could only passively take a beating. Therefore, he did not choose to do that. He chose to draw his sword. In such a tense moment, he did not forget to send a strand of sword intent from the yellow paper umbrella into the dagger. A huge boom rang out. The stone platform in front of the mausoleum's main entrance began to shake violently. The rainwater on the ground was like frightened ghosts, tearing and transforming in an attempt to escape, turning into a large mist. In the corner behind the mist, Su Yorong was affected by the shaking. Her face instantly paled and she could no longer endure it. It was extremely uncomfortable, so she closed her eyes and began to adjust her breathing to resist. The mist fell. Chen Chongqing was still standing in his original position, only he was a bit shorter than before. Upon closer inspection, he discovered that his 2 feet had actually sunk deeply into the hard limestone ground, all the way to his knees. Ting Xiaoming's heavy blow that fell from the sky like a mountain was truly too terrifying. Chen Chongqing relied on the dagger and the strand of sword intent to forcefully receive this heavy blow. Even though his body had been bathed in the true blood of the black dragon, it still felt like it was about to shatter. From the center of his eyebrows to his collarbone to his neck and then to his ankles, every single bone in his body was in unbearable pain. His right hand constantly trembled, like an old man with a serious illness. If it were not for the fact that he knew that he would definitely die without his sword, how could his right hand still hold onto the hilt of his sword? Ting Xiaoming stood within the torrential rain, his face expressionless. The carrying pole that he held in his right hand was actually an iron rod, as thick as a normal person's arm. It was forged from the Demon Mountain's secret iron mixed with 2 taels of meteorite true gold, making it incomparably hard. On the battlefield of the snowy plains, who knew how many experts of the great Zhou army had been smashed to death by it? At this moment, tens of extremely deep sword marks had appeared on this iron rod, especially the tip, which had even been cut in half. The iron rod and Chen Chongqing's dagger had only clashed for an instant, but it had already been cut into so many sword marks. It had to be said that the sharpness of that dagger had already reached an unimaginable level, and that sword intent was even more powerful and swift. to the point of causing one's heart to tremble. However, Ting Xiaoming did not have any reaction to this. He looked at Chen Chongqing in silence, like a true mountain peak. No matter how violent the wind and rain were, it still could not shake his body in the slightest, giving off an exceptionally solemn feeling. This was a true expert. Chen Chongqing looked at the demon male standing within the rain and naturally had this thought, but then had even more thoughts. Just as Nank had said before, he could only display 1,000th of the true power of that sword intent, so how could he defeat such a powerful opponent? Most importantly, with his current level of strength, if he wanted to block or even defeat this iron rod, the combination of that sword intent and dagger was far from enough. He needed a sword that could better display the power of that sword intent. He needed an even heavier sword. Just as he was thinking of these things, Ting Xiaoming once again raised the iron rod in his hand. The iron rod that was densely covered with sword marks seemed even more frightening than before, and the torrential rain around the iron rod suddenly dispersed. A sound like thunder resounded upon the divine avenue. The iron rod whistled through the air, and all the wind and rain in its path dodged. At this moment, Nank's sword energy had already been completely shattered by the sword intent emitted by the yellow paper umbrella, and the zither-playing old man's mental attack had also been blocked. At this moment, Chen Chongqing could attempt to use the yellow paper umbrella to receive the iron rod. His face was still pale, but it was not because he was nervous, but because the rain was too cold. It was also because he was uneasy about the last thought that appeared in his mind. He could use the yellow paper umbrella to receive the iron rod, but he did not want to. This was because he had a faint feeling that although the sword intent attached to the yellow paper umbrella was incomparably powerful, it was not the best way for him to receive the iron rod at his current level. He still felt that he needed an even heavier sword. In reality, other than the yellow paper umbrella, he had no other choice, because he did not have a heavier sword. But he felt that he should have a heavy sword. Just as this thought appeared in Chen Chongqing's mind, a strange change occurred somewhere in the plains to the south of the mausoleum. The rain in the distance was much lighter than the rain in the mausoleum. The surface of the water in the grass was softly beaten by the fine rain, but suddenly, for some reason, the ground of the plains sank as if it was collapsing. The puddles of water in the plains and the rain in the sky were instantly condensed into a ball of water, becoming incomparably dense, as if there was an extremely heavy object underground that was currently attracting everything in its surroundings. An angry whistle resounded from the depths of the dusky sky. This whistle came from the Great Prung. Just what item was about to appear that could actually make it so angry? He could even hear its vigilance and unease. The heavy iron rod broke through the wind and rain on the divine path, arriving in front of the main entrance of the mausoleum. It was only a dozen or so zhang away from Chen Chongqing, yet he did not raise the yellow paper umbrella. Instead, with a clear cry, he sheathed the dagger. He himself did not know why he did this. Why did he sheathe the dagger? Just at this moment, a loud rumble resounded from outside the mausoleum, as if true wind and thunder had arrived on the ground. Compared to the sound of wind and thunder, the sound of wind and thunder carried by the iron rod was like the sound of firecrackers that children made during the New Year. A black object broke through the torrential rain, arrived in front of Chen Chongqing, and then stopped moving. It was a sword, pitch black, forged from some unknown material. There were no designs on the body of the sword, nor was it smooth. It seemed especially rough, and did not even have a sword edge, as if it had not completed its forging. In short, this iron sword did not have any special characteristic. It did not emit any qi that would raise one's eyebrows. It was only very wide, very straight, very long, very thick, and very black, so it seemed very heavy. Chen Chongqing wanted an even heavier sword. As a result, a heavy sword appeared before his eyes, quietly hovering in the storm. The hilt of the iron sword was slanted downwards. As long as he extended his hand, he would be able to easily grasp it. The posture of the iron sword was too comfortable, so comfortable that he did not even think before raising his hand. His right hand passed through the seemingly still curtains of rain and grasped the hilt. The hilt of the iron sword was also very thick, very rough. His palm and the surface of the hilt seemed to completely merge together, and he could clearly feel a heavy feeling. At this moment, something happened. The strand of sword intent attached to the yellow paper umbrella did not listen to the commands of Chen Chongqing's divine sense. It passed through his body and entered the metal sword. This was because the metal sword originally had a strand of sword intent. The sword intent in the yellow paper umbrella disdained or did not want to compete with the powerful sword intent. With Chen Chongqing's current cultivation level and cultivation in the path of the sword, he was still unable to accurately sense the strength of the sword intent in the iron sword. However, he could clearly sense that the sword intent was just like the iron sword, incomparably heavy. He pulled back his hand and took the iron sword out of the rain. If he wanted to take the heavy iron sword out of the rain, he needed an extremely powerful strength. At the same time, the heavy iron sword also bestowed him with an extremely powerful strength. Afterwards, he swung the iron sword and chopped down at the iron rod that broke through the rain. The iron sword and the iron rod met in the torrential rain. There was an extremely short period of silence, and then there were the continuous explosions of wind and thunder. The rain was shattered, turning into thousands of water arrows. They followed a circle and shot out in all directions. The cliff in front of the main entrance of the mausoleum was riddled with countless deep and small holes. A clear light emitted from the tong bough on Su Yorong's back. It protected her, but it could not protect Chen Chongqing. Chen Chongqing's clothes were filled with tiny holes, like leaves that had been eaten by insects. They floated in the rain, and his face was extremely pale. His 2 feet were still stuck in the hard limestone ground, and there were cracks like spiderwebs all around him. He looked rather miserable. However, he did not retreat a single step. The powerful demon general retreated. He was directly knocked back over 100 zhang, and fell heavily into the rain. He constantly spat out blood, and the iron rod in his hand was bent at an extremely exaggerated angle. The sound of the torrential rain was still like thunder, and the entire divine path was deathly silent. Today there will be an early report that will be updated very late. I've said it in the book, in the group, and on the WeChat official account, but there are still some readers who did not see it. Now that I think about it, the simplest method is still to trouble everyone to pay attention to the WeChat official account. That way, if there's something, I can directly tell everyone. Today this is the chapter. Tomorrow it will be over 7,000 words. Chapter 330. The torrential rain continued to fall. Ting Xiaoming stood up with difficulty and wiped away the blood flowing from the corner of his mouth. He looked at the metal sword in Chen Chongqing's hand and was shocked speechless. He thought to himself, just what kind of sword is this, to actually have such a terrifying weight, a thunderous might, and an unimaginably vigorous sword intent? Where did this metal sword come from? Why did it appear in front of the mausoleum? Chen Chongqing knew that this metal sword came from the sword pool. Although up until now, he only knew that the sword pool was in this torrential grassland, he did not know its exact location. At the same time, the moment he grasped the sword hilt, he knew the origins of this metal sword. In the history of the path of the sword, this metal sword was extremely famous. It was called the Mountain Sea Sword. Countless years ago, the heavenly tomes turned into countless meteorites and descended into the world, dragging along flowing fire. They landed in the center of the continent, which was the current mausoleum of books. Other than those stone tablets, there were also many remnants of meteorite fragment. The predecessors collected these meteorite fragments and used all methods to refine them. Finally, they refined meteorite metal, which was also known as meteorite true gold. Meteorite metal was different from any other metal on the continent. It was extremely heavy, extremely tough, and could be said to be the best material for forging swords. In reality, most of the meteorite metal on the continent was used to forge a sword. It was also the profound iron-heavy sword in Qin Chongqing's hand. It was as heavy as a mountain and as mighty as the sea, hence its name, the Mountain Sea Sword. The metal rod in Ting Xiaoming's hand was only mixed with 4 taels of meteorite true gold, yet it was as heavy as a mountain. Let alone this metal sword that was completely forged from meteorite metal, just how heavy was it, and how terrifying was its power? The Mountain Sea Sword was extremely famous in history. No matter if it was on the battlefield or outside the Tong Palace, this sword and its successive masters had performed scenes of sorrow and joy, life and death. It was unknown just how many experts and famous people the metal sword had smashed to death before. However, the person who truly allowed the Mountain Sea Sword to shine was its last recorded master. 1,000 years ago, an expert called Shiku appeared on the continent. He had the bloodline of the White Emperor, and it was said that he cultivated the techniques of the Buddhist sect that had disappeared long ago. Adding on his innate divine strength, in terms of strength and vigor, he could be ranked in the top 3 in history. And when he raised the heavy metal sword in his hand, he could even rival an army of 10,000. Only an expert like this had the right to use the Mountain Sea Sword and unleash the full power of the Mountain Sea Sword. Only the Mountain Sea Sword was worthy of such an exceptional expert. No one knew whether it was Sheikah who made the Mountain Sea Sword famous, or whether it was the Mountain Sea Sword that made Sheikah raise countless storms on the continent. In short, when the Iron Sword and the 2 experts met, they won countless battles. With the Mountain Sea Sword in hand, Sheikah consecutively defeated powerful enemies on the continent. Back then, the head instructor of Scholatry Manor and the Grand Elder of the Longevity sect were both defeated by him. He was incomparably tyrannical, and some people even believed that he had already entered the Saint realm. In the end, just like many peerless experts of the past, he walked into the garden of Zhou brimming with lofty sentiments, then left the garden of Zhou in despair. The Mountain Sea Sword never appeared by his side again. After another 3 years, in a very coincidental conflict outside of Yunyang City, he died at the hands of a junior who had just made a name for himself. That question seemed to have finally been answered. Without the Mountain Sea Sword, he seemed to be just an ordinary expert. However, the Pope had a completely different view of this. He believed that the most important thing was that the most important thing that Sheikah, who had lost at the hands of Zhou ***, had lost was not this sword, but his arrogant and tyrannical heart of the sword. This was the Mountain Sea Sword. If one were to list the 10 most famous swords in the world, no matter who came to choose, this iron sword would definitely be among them. The Mountain Sea Sword was made from the rarest meteoric iron, and it had been forged for the longest time. It was the most precious. No matter who was able to obtain this iron sword, they would definitely be so excited that they would be unable to control themselves, unable to believe their own luck. Qin Chongqing was also very happy. He thought to himself that if he could bring this iron sword out of the garden of Zhou, it would be most suitable for Xianyuan Po to use. Also, Zhixiu had always said that he wanted a sword, so what kind of sword should he get? Only now did he notice that the top of the iron sword was not naturally straight. The rumor that the Mountain Sea Sword was definitely edgeless was not accurate. Speaking of which, such a divine weapon definitely had a hidden edge hidden within the bluntness. It was just that it had been cut in half. Was it cut in half by that blade? To actually be able to cut off a section of the Mountain Sea Sword, just how powerful was that blade, and just how powerful was that person? The Mountain Sea Sword had not appeared in the world for close to 1,000 years, only leaving behind rumors. As a result, Ting Xiaoming did not recognize it at the very beginning. However, with just a few glances, he thought about the tremendous power that came from the iron sword, and very naturally guessed the origin of the iron sword. As a result, he was even more shocked. He remained silent and slightly furrowed his brows, thinking about something. Nank also recognized the origin of the iron sword. Her clear and childish voice pierced through the curtain of rain, filled with anger and confusion. "This is impossible. How could the mountain sea sword appear in the world for a guy like you?" Chen Chongqing did not say anything. He raised the iron sword and pointed it at her through the wind and rain. Actions were more powerful than words. If the mountain sea sword had not appeared for him, why was it currently in his hands? "And you don't even understand the sword style of the mountain sea sword, how could you display such a great power?" Nank asked a very important question. Just like what was said before, even if the mountain sea sword and its sword intent existed, without a corresponding sword style, with Chen Chongqing's cultivation at the upper level of ethereal opening, how could he so easily defeat a demon general? Chen Chongqing had no intention of hiding it. He said to her, "I've read quite a lot of books." This was what Go Hanshi had said to him at the Ivy League gathering last year, and it was also what he had said to Go Hanshi. It was also something that only he and Go Hanshi had the right to say to each other. No one else could, because no one had read more books than him and Go Hanshi. The 3,000 scriptures of the Taoist canon encompassed all the phenomena of the stars. They were as beautiful as jade, and there were also 1,000 methods. Methods were methods. After saying this, Chen Chongqing suddenly missed the Ivy League gathering, missed the capital, missed the Orthodox Academy. The disputes at those times were all disputes of personal feelings. They did not concern life or death, did not distinguish between humans and demons, and did not have shameless assassinations, sneak attacks, or betrayals. Now that he thought about it, those disputes could not help but be somewhat laughable, but also so cute. Compared to the blood in the Garden of Zhou, how could he not miss it? The surroundings of the mausoleum became quiet once again, because the legendary mountain sea sword had appeared. Because Chen Chongqing actually knew how to use the mountain sea sword. Most importantly, it was not sword intent, but a real sword. Not many people knew that a sword had also appeared in the Garden of Zhou, which was then taken away by Su Li. In the eyes of Nank and the other demon experts, the iron sword that Chen Chongqing was holding was the first sword to appear in the history of the Garden of Zhou. What did this mean? This was unprecedented. Whenever there was an unprecedented, it would often be accompanied by thunder and a heaven-shaking change. Just where did this heavy black iron sword come from? Did its sudden appearance mean that the sword pool was about to appear in the world? Would those famous swords of the legends also appear one after the other? What made Nank the most confused and even angry was that she could not understand why the sword pool would help Chen Chongqing. She looked at the dusky plain around the mausoleum and allowed the rain to wash her small, pale face. She squinted her eyes and searched for a very long time, but she still could not find any clues related to the sword pool. This made her even more silent. Could it be that more swords will appear? Will those swords continue to help you? Just like that peerless sword intent and that tyrannical iron sword? Even if they do, could it be that you know all the sword styles? I don't believe it. Nank thought about these things, then extended her hands into the torrential rain. With her movements, the two maids that had always been standing behind her in the rain suddenly paled. Hua Chui's charming face in particular seemed to be in extreme pain, and a stream of blood sprayed out from her lips. Nank's petite body trembled slightly, as if she was about to fall into the rain, but in the end she did not. An extremely cold qi emitted from her body, mixing with the stream of blood that Hua Chui had spat out. Hua Chui's blood was green. The stream of green blood was not diluted by the torrential rain. After mixing with Nank's cold qi, it instead became even more dense. It was extremely demonic and demonic, on the verge of condensing, and the edges faintly undulated. It was a peacock plume. Whoosh! The peacock plume that seemed both real and illusory pierced through the countless curtains of rain and attacked him. The peacock plume was mixed with Nank's true blood. It would ignite upon contact with the wind, fiercely burning along the way. Even the violent falling rain was unable to weaken the fire in the slightest. Instead, it made the flames more and more violent. Ever since he had fled into the plain, he had been treating Su Yorong the entire time, so Qin Chongqing was extremely clear on the terrifying aspects of the peacock plume. He did not know if the yellow paper umbrella could endure the burning of the true blood of the peacock. As for the poison in the true blood of the peacock, it made him extremely vigilant. He had to admit that Nank's battle awareness and decisiveness were extremely terrifying. She possessed a maturity and callousness that far surpassed her age. She did not hesitate to use up her most precious true blood precisely to deal with Qin Chongqing's sword and umbrella. The might of the black metal heavy sword was unparalleled, tyrannical like the mountains and seas, but it had lost its flexibility, especially in Qin Chongqing's hands. The sword intent in the yellow paper umbrella was even more swift and fierce, but things like poison and true blood could not be cut apart. Qin Chongqing was not worried that he would be poisoned, but he did not want to be stained with even the slightest bit of that poisonous blood. In the blink of an eye, he used the two swords and the umbrella at his side to think of countless ways to deal with the peacock plume, but he discovered that none of them were perfect. However, if he had that sword, perhaps he could resolve this problem. When this idea arose, even he himself felt that it was very absurd, because it was too inconceivable, too extravagant, too unreasonable. Just why did you have whatever you wanted? No one knew where that sword was. Even if it was in the garden of Zhou, just why? Just because when he needed a sword intent, that sword intent would appear in his body. When he needed a heavy sword, the heaviest sword in the world, the mountain sea sword, would appear in the rain in front of him, waiting for him to extend his hand and take it. Right now, he needed that sword, so perhaps that sword would appear? In the next chapter, before 7 o'clock. Yesterday, I mentioned my WeChat official account, and a friend asked. I thought that everyone knew about it, but it's on the page. Mountie 1118. This is my WeChat official account. Regarding novel updates, plots, questions and answers, games, peripherals, idle chatter, acting cute, swearing, and other personal matters, they're basically all placed there. Chapter 331. The sword that Qin Chongqing wanted was naturally in the garden of Zhou. More accurately, it was in the sword pool. Although he still did not know where the sword pool was, the sword that he wanted was undoubtedly a famous sword, just like the mountain sea sword in his hands. In reality, the sword he wanted was ranked far below the mountain sea sword on the tier of legendary weapons, but in certain aspects, it was even more famous than the mountain sea sword. This was because that sword was extremely rare, a sword that Zhou Dufu had brought back from the outside world to the Garden of Zhou. More importantly, that sword was the temple sword of the South Stream Temple. In other words, that sword was the Holy Maiden sword. Qin Chongqing did not know that the girl behind him was Su Yorong. Even now, he still did not have any good feelings towards the name Su Yorong. The reason he wanted this sword was naturally not because he wanted to prepare a dowry for his fiancée, but because according to the legends, the temple sword of South Stream Temple possessed a sacred light that could purify all poisons. It could naturally suppress the blood techniques of the demons. This idea was truly absurd, but it had become a reality. Just when he had this idea, an extremely refreshing feeling suddenly appeared in a certain place in the plains to the south of the mausoleum. The weeds that seemed extremely tired with their heads lowered in the torrential rain once again straightened their waist. Raindrops flowed down the veins of the leaves, and they became 100 times more spirited. An extremely faint sword intent appeared in the boundless vitality, then disappeared without a trace. In the next moment, the sword intent arrived on the stone platform in front of the mausoleum's main entrance. Along with it, a sword appeared. The sword seemed very simple and clean, without any superfluous decorations. It emitted a faint divine aura, greatly illuminating the gloom brought about by the torrential rain. This was the temple sword that Qin Chongqing wanted. He extended his hand into the rain, took the temple sword, and slashed at the incoming peacock plume. The furious cry of a sparrow could be heard from within the raging flames, and then with a hiss, the sparks of fire attached to the peacock plume transformed into smoke. The terrifying poison contained within the bloody flames was instantly purified into nothingness by the sacred light emitted by the temple sword. Silence, absolute silence. Nank's small face became even paler. The two maids behind her opened their eyes wide, their faces filled with disbelief. The zither-playing old man's eyes revealed an expression of fear, and Ting Xiaoming's expression was extremely grave. Suddenly, the sound of rain stopped. Lu Wan who had not acted the entire time, rushed up the divine path. The large pot in her hand transformed into a dark night, covering the temple sword that was still emitting sacred light. Chen Chongsheng let go of the temple sword's hilt and gripped the mountain sea sword again in the rain. He flicked it towards the pot. Only a metallic sound could be heard, and qi surged wildly. The black pot was directly sent flying by the metal sword, opening and opening in the darkness. After the darkness was not the blue sky, but Lu Wan-er's hands. She held a ribbon in her hands. The ribbon was extremely soft and smooth, and when it was wrapped around the mountain sea sword, it actually stopped the heavy metal sword from moving. Just at this moment, Ting Xiaoming, whose mind was connected to hers, gripped the iron staff and once again descended from the rain, smashing towards his head. Just at this moment, there was another strange movement in the depths of the plains. A slender sword passed through the several dozen li of torrential rain like a stream of light and arrived in front of the main entrance of the mausoleum. It was as if it had automatically stuffed itself into Chen Chongsheng's right hand that had just let go of the hilt of the mountain sea sword. The hilt of the sword was slender and delicate, giving people the feeling that it was a needle. Chen Chongsheng gripped the sword and thrust it towards Lu Wan-er. The delicate body of the sword seemed to be unable to withstand the baptism of the torrential rain. It constantly trembled on the way, and the tip of the sword moved like lightning, as if it was embroidering something in the rain. He didn't know what sword it was or what sword technique he used, but he felt that it was extremely soft and supple. The sword moves were green and the flowers were red, and the scene was beautiful. With a swish, the delicate sword was unable to embroider a beautiful picture in the rain. Instead, it pierced through the ribbon around the mountain sea sword. The delicate sword continued to pierce through the droplets of rain. In the end, it arrived in front of Lu Wan-er and pierced her earlobe. If Ting Xiaoming's deformed iron rod had not smashed down, perhaps this delicate sword would have directly pierced through Lu Wan-er's neck. The iron rod pierced through the air. Chen Chongsheng let go of the delicate sword and gripped the mountain sea sword in the rain again. He lifted it up, and it was still a flick. With a deafening sound of collision, the iron rod whistled through the air and landed somewhere unknown. Ting Xiaoming grabbed Lu Wan-er's shoulder without hesitation and frantically retreated, narrowly avoiding Chen Chongsheng's next strike. No matter if it was the delicate sword or the mountain sea sword, Chen Chongsheng had used the flick for the 3 consecutive strikes. He had picked the thread from the cloth and carried the lantern in the night. He had picked it cleanly and efficiently, and he had picked it extremely naturally. The 3 swords quietly floated in the heavy rain around him. The scene was very shocking. Looking at the temple sword that emitted a faint sacred light, Nank could no longer suppress the shock in her heart. She was even unwilling to think about why the legendary Holy Maiden's sword had appeared. She said angrily, "How can you even know the sword style of the South Stream Temple? Could this be the Yu Maiden sword?" Lu Wan-er looked at the delicate and slender sword in the rain beside him. She was very shocked, and did not notice that a drop of dark red blood had seeped out of her earlobe. In the southeast corner of the continent, there was once a powerful sword sect. The disciples of the sect were mostly women, and it was located in the former land of Yu, so it was called the Yu Maiden sect. It had once produced many experts of the path of the sword, but several hundred years ago, it merged with the South Stream Temple, and then gradually became unknown. As for the South Stream Temple, there was no need to say much. As the holy land of the southern sects of the Orthodoxy, it had always been revered and worshipped by tens of thousands of people. Nank and Lu Wanner were naturally shocked by the appearance of these two swords. What they could not understand even more was how Chen Chongqing even knew the sword styles of the South Stream Temple and the Yu Maiden sect. It must be known that these two sword styles emphasized divine purification and small details. Very few men would practice them. Chen Chongqing did not explain. He was able to grasp the sword styles of the South Stream Temple and the Yu Maiden sect. At the very least, he was able to grasp the rough moves and sword forms of these two sword styles. Other than being well versed in the Taoist canon, the most important reason was his diligence. In the year that he had spent in the Orthodox Academy from Xining village to the capital, what he had done the most was reading and cultivating. He had studied all the cultivation methods in the world. Other than the youths of the Divine State's 7 laws in the Mountly Sword sect, there was no one else of his age that was as diligent as him. Looking at Chen Chongqing on the stone platform in the storm, both Nank and Lu Wanner felt extremely uneasy. Amongst the demon experts that had entered the garden of Zhou, Ting Xiaoming was the most taciturn one. In terms of status, he was the 24th demon general. Let alone the lofty Princess Nank, he was not even as high as his own wife. However, all the nobles in Xuelao City knew that this was because he deeply loved his wife. In terms of true battle prowess and insight, he was the strongest one present. As a result, he did not allow the shocking scene in front of him to shake his mind. He extended his right hand into the rain and summoned back his metal rod from some unknown place. He stepped on the divine path, creating a series of splashes. With a howl, he once again attacked Chen Chongqing. The other experts also came to their senses. They knew that they could not allow the battle to continue developing like this. Chen Chongqing, who was already in desperate straits, suddenly obtained the assistance of 3 famed swords. Who knew what would happen next? The sound of air being pierced rang out one after another. A strong gale arose on the divine path, and the torrential rain was blown askew like a weak willow. An extremely serene and clear sound of a zither, carrying an undisguised killing intent, accompanied by several strong gusts of wind, attacked Chen Chongqing at the edge of the stone platform. Just at this moment, a howl suddenly resounded in the rain. This howl was the howl of a sword. It was extremely sharp and resounded through the world, yet strangely, it was exceptionally deep. It was like the howl of an ancient dragon. In the distant sky, the shadow of the great Ping was slowly descending. Suddenly, it was stopped for a moment by this dragon's howl. The zither-playing old man's complexion suddenly paled. His fingers, which were stroking the zither strings, began to tremble violently. With a few snaps, the zither strings suddenly snapped and he spat out a mouthful of blood. The zither on his knees was instantly dyed red. Just what was this thing? With a howl, it actually possessed such divine might. Just at this moment, a sword pierced through the rain and arrived in front of Chen Chongqing. Its sword intent was extremely arrogant and incomparably tyrannical. "Dragon Cry Sword!" Lu Wanner cried out in surprise. Chen Chongqing took the Dragoncry sword from the rain and slashed at Ting Xiaoming. The mausoleum suddenly lit up. It was as if an illusory dragon had spouted out from the sword and heavily struck Ting Xiaoming's abdomen. With a terrifying muffled sound, Ting Xiaoming was sent flying several hundred zhang away below the divine path. Who knew how many of his sternum had been fractured? Nank was close. True blood violently burned in her eyes. Chen Chongqing looked at her eyes and suddenly released the hilt of the Dragoncry sword. He extended his hand into the rain once again. Another extremely bright sword flew over from afar and landed in his hand. He gripped the sword and moved forward. The surface of the sword, which was like water, directly slashed Nank back. Another cry of surprise rang out on the divine path, "Autumn Water Sword!" This was not the end. This was only the beginning. The sound of the sword piercing through the rain rang out without end. Shocked voices rang out without end. Jade Lake Sword! 8 Zhang Divine Sword! How is this possible? This is the Demon Commander's Banner Sword. The next chapter is before 9 o'clock. Chapter 332. Swords constantly flew over from all parts of the grassland, and then arrived in the rainy sky in front of the mausoleum. A dozen or so swords hovered around Chen Chongqing. Countless qis shook the heavens and the earth, but no matter if it was Ting Xiaoming's tyrannical demonic arts or Nank's burning true blood, he only needed to stretch out his hand to grab a sword from the rain, and then he could break through it with a wave of his hand. Ning Cui and Hua Qiu saw this scene, and their faces paled. They felt that their legs were somewhat weak, and they could barely stand. Some of the swords were long, some were short, some were wide, some were thin, some were tyrannical, some were low-key, some emitted sacred light, and some overflowed with demonic qi. However, they all had a similar characteristic. These swords were all very famous. The Mountain Sea Sword, the Holy Maiden Sword, the Yu Maiden Sword, the Autumn Water Sword, the Jade Lake Sword, the 8 Zhang Divine Sword, the Demon Commander's Banner Sword, the Dragoncry Sword. After several hundred years, these famous swords that had disappeared for a long time finally appeared before the eyes of the people. Now, these swords quietly stopped in the rain. Chen Chongqing stood in the rain of swords. In the end, time was still the most powerful magical artifact. The famous swords of the past were already broken. The one that was best preserved was the Temple Sword of South Stream Temple, followed by the Mountain Sea Sword. The other swords were more or less damaged. Some of the swords carried the soil of the grassland, and when the soil was gradually washed away by the rain, the rust within was revealed. They no longer had their original elegance, and it made people feel sorrow. However, in the torrential rain, these swords still emitted a cold and proud qi. Nank could not understand, could not accept. Why would these once incomparably proud famous swords listen to Chen Chongqing's will? No matter how she thought, she could not find an answer. Chen Chongqing himself did not know. He only knew that these once peerless famous swords wanted to leave the garden of Zhou. However, in the past several hundred years, there were many human and demon cultivators that entered the plains of the unsetting sun. Why did these swords choose him? The most important reason was the strand of sword intent in the yellow paper umbrella. That sword intent had separated from the swords several hundred years ago, and from that day, it became the only free soul in the sword pool. It represented those famous swords that could not leave the sword pool, and it constantly released its qi outside the grassland. Chen Chongqing held the yellow paper umbrella, so he could clearly feel that sword intent. When he let the sword intent enter the yellow paper umbrella, it signified the return of an old friend that had once left the sword pool. He had proven his identity to those proud famed swords. But this was not enough. These famed swords had been covered in dust for many years, and their lofty aspirations had long since faded away. If they did not have enough confidence in leaving, they would rather continue to sleep at the bottom of the sword pool. At the very least, they would be able to exist for a few more years. Otherwise, if they gathered the last of their sword intent to make this gamble and failed, it was extremely likely that their swords would break and their wills would perish. Chen Chongqing had to prove to these swords that he had enough perseverance, that he had enough ability to bring them out of the garden of Zhou. The former was not a problem. He was a youth in the prime of his youth. His clean eyes were filled with stubbornness and the desire for freedom. The latter was originally a huge problem. However, after the black dragon's soul entered his body and began to sleep, it was no longer a problem. The Rui jade that black dragon's soul leaving was attached to was currently tied to his wrist. As the rain washed over it, it grew brighter and brighter. This jade Rui was the Tianhai Divine Empress's personal magical artifact and carried her powerful qi. Through his sword intent and the yellow paper umbrella, Chen Chongqing's perseverance and amiability combined with this powerful qi spread throughout the entire plain. Even though those peerless swords were broken, their sword intent still existed. They had followed their masters and seen countless experts. Their experience and knowledge were extremely vast. However, when they sensed the powerful aura emitted from that jade scepter, they were also shocked. Even if Zhou Dufu was still alive, the owner of that powerful qi could still bring them out of the garden of Zhou, let alone now? Thus, they arrived at Chen Chongqing's side, cloaked in rain. But where were these swords normally? Just where was the sword pool? The rain washed over those old famed swords, and also washed over Nank's small face. Her face grew whiter and whiter, just like the temple sword. The flames in her eyes were gradually extinguished, but there was still no fear. Shock and anger were her respect for the history that these swords represented and her disdain for Chen Chongqing, as well as the disappointment she felt from the contrast between the two. This was an intense emotional reaction, but it did not represent anything else. Looking at the dozen or so famed swords floating around Chen Chongqing in the rain, she said after a moment of silence, "Back then, you were only defeated by the having blade. Could it be that you want to rebel today?" Those swords did not understand her words, and continued to remain silent in the rain. The cold rain dripped down from the demon commander's banner sword, falling from the flat section of the mountain sea sword. They did not answer her. Nank raised the soul wood in her hand. After being soaked by the rain, the black soul wood seemed even darker and heavier. The monster tied around the mausoleum was already restless. Now, with her action, they became even more berserk. Countless mournful roars of monsters left the ground of the plain, bombarding the place where the rain fell. She did not want to do this, but Chen Chongqing and these swords forced her to do it. At this moment, she could not care so much, even if the mausoleum of Zhou would be defiled by millions of low-class monsters. The soul would suddenly shone brightly. The black sea of the monster tide stirred up countless huge waves, accompanied by countless terrifying roars. The plain began to tremble, and even the mausoleum began to tremble. Countless monsters began to attack. Nank looked at him and yelled, "Chen Chongqing, do you think that by relying on these old and clumsy broken swords, you can survive?" Chen Chongqing looked at the boundless sea of monsters around the mausoleum, and said nothing. Not far behind him, Su Yorong leaned against the main entrance of the mausoleum, hugging the Wu Bao and wrapped in sackcloth. Her eyes were closed, and it was unknown when she would wake up again. 7,000 words done. Tomorrow, 6,000 and above, I'll die of exhaustion in the fire beacon. About adding 4 tails of meteoric iron to make it heavier, that was definitely wrong. I often make this kind of stupid mistake. I've already changed a small amount in my manuscript, but I haven't changed it in the main text. I thought it was a method to mock me. Today is Monday, so I'll have to trouble everyone to vote for me. Also, I'll have to trouble everyone to vote for the free golden keyboard. I'll just have to ask everyone to vote for your works. It's been hard on everyone, and it's been hard on me. Chapter 333. When the sword intent appeared, when the metal sword arrived by Chen Chongqing's side, the monster tide that was like an ocean around the mausoleum had already reacted. Perhaps they were afraid, or angry, or restless, but they were suppressed by Nank. At this moment, as the soul wood in her hand shone brightly, the restriction suddenly disappeared. How could the tens of thousands of monsters in the grassland hold back any longer? One by one, they madly rushed towards the mausoleum. For a moment the earth trembled, and the world became dark and gloomy. Even the majestic torrential rain seemed to have an additional smell of blood and filth. Only the terrifying shadow remained silent. Although it slowly floated towards the ground, it did not have any intention of displaying its divine might. Perhaps it was because of the Great Peng's performance that the high-level monsters with peak star condensation strength in the depths of the grassland did not follow the monster tide towards the mausoleum. They were not resisting the summons of the soul wood, nor were they resisting Nank's will. Instead, they were more intelligent, and vaguely sensed that something even more serious was about to happen, so they were on guard. The seriousness here was obviously related to the Garden of Zhou. Countless monsters transformed into a black tide and surged towards the mausoleum. The quiet plains of the unsetting sun had long become chaotic. The pools of water at the bottom of the grass were torn to pieces by the sharp claws of the monsters, and then flattened by the scales. The soil was constantly sent flying, and the clear water became incomparably turbid. It was a majestic and terrifying sight. Just like what was said before, even if a saint was here, they would not be able to kill all the monsters that were endlessly surging towards the mausoleum. They could only escape. Chen Chongqing stood in the torrential rain and looked at this scene. Naturally, he wanted to retreat, but he already had nowhere else to go. Around him, a dozen or so famed swords quietly floated in the rain. These swords had once experienced the vicissitudes of the world, but now they had already experienced the vicissitudes of life. They were either damaged or covered in rust. When they first appeared, they possessed astonishing might, but in the end, they were no longer as vigorous as they were in the past. Most importantly, the peerless experts that had once wielded these swords had already passed away. With just these dozen or so damaged swords, it was impossible to block the attacks of the monster tide. If he wanted to become an unfalling reef in the black ocean, he needed even more swords. Chen Chongqing's gaze passed through the heavy curtain of rain and gazed at the grassland surrounding the mausoleum. He looked at the terrifying monster tide, wanting to find even more swords. Those swords should be in the sword pool, but for some reason, they did not appear like the mountain sea sword. They were still waiting for his summons, or perhaps he could persuade them. Only, just where was the sword pool? If you are here, please come out and meet me, because I need you. This was his intention. It flowed along the slightly trembling handle of the yellow paper umbrella and into the surface of the umbrella, dispersing into the boundless grassland. He looked at the distant grassland in the misty rain, looked at the grassland groaning under the belly of the flood dragon, and said to the unknown sword pool in his heart, "I will take you away from this abandoned old garden. Perhaps you will sleep, but at least it will not be in this grassland that will never have night and cannot sleep peacefully." The monster tide grew closer and closer. The distance to the divine path below the mausoleum was only several li. Standing at the edge of the stone platform, Chen Chongqing could even clearly see the scarlet mouth of the purple lightning leopard at the very front, as well as the saliva dripping from the corner of its mouth. It was even as if he could smell the stench of the saliva. Right at this moment, he suddenly felt a tremor. This tremor had nothing to do with the beast tide or the storm. This vibration came from the depths of the sea of grass, from the depths of the great earth. It was extremely fine, clearly a bit weak, but it was just that real. The purple lightning leopard was like a bolt of true purple lightning, breaking through the dense water plants and madly charging towards the mausoleum. Its scarlet eyes were filled with a bloodthirsty and berserk chi. Suddenly, a hint of wariness appeared in its eyes, which then split open. Immediately after, the corner of its lips also split open. The dripping saliva mixed with the blood, turning it a scarlet red. It felt danger and madly increased its speed, attempting to break away from the tremor. The tremor was truly very weak. When it reached the ground, it felt very slow. However, the lightning-like purple lightning leopard was unable to break away from the tremor. There was a soft tearing sound in the rain. Crack! The purple lightning leopard's body split into pieces, turning into a dozen or so lumps of blood. As it ran, it scattered, but it still maintained its previous speed. Only after traveling several dozen zhang did it fall to the ground. The scene was extremely strange and terrifying. In the paw prints left behind by the purple lightning leopard, the soft soil constantly churned and a sword slowly appeared. This was a broken sword that only had half a blade remaining. The hilt of the sword was deeply rusted, and the half of the blade was covered in mud. It looked abnormally miserable, no different from scrap metal. The broken sword quietly lay in the mud and grass. The rain continued to fall. With the washing of the rain, the mud on the blade was washed away, but it could not wash away the rust. It was still gray and gloomy, without a single gleam of sharpness. However, it was still slightly lighter. The broken sword incessantly trembled, struggling, attempting to leave the ground. It was like a heavily injured soldier using a crutch to stand up again and kill the enemy. After an unknown amount of time, the broken sword finally left the ground. It flew crookedly towards the mausoleum, as if it could fall to the ground again at any time. In the plains of the unsetting sun, the monster whose speed was second only to the purple lightning leopard was the wind wolf. These monsters were born from the crossbreeding of the wolves of the snowy plains and the demon wolves of the great western continent. They were born with inconceivable speed, and it was said that they were the only monsters on the continent that could successfully hunt red falcons. Of course, this was mainly due to the wind wolves' collective battle prowess and perseverance. The strange death of the purple lightning leopard in front of them did not slow the wind wolf pack in the slightest. As the most loyal and bloodthirsty protector of the mausoleum of Zhou, the leader of the wolf pack received the order from the Soul Wood to tear apart all the intruders that dared to enter the mausoleum. Most importantly, the wolf pack was composed of several hundred wind wolves. Even if some of them died to those broken swords, there would always be even more wind wolves that would charge through and then attack the enemy. The wolf pack possessed extremely strong hunting intelligence. In the long period of waiting, the leader of the wolf pack had already led his subordinates to silently push through the other monsters and arrive at the white grass path. This was because the ground here was the hardest and the closest to the main entrance of the mausoleum, making it the most suitable place to charge. The mournful white grass on the white grass path was completely shattered. The wolf pack swept past like the wind. Because their speed was too fast and there were too many of them, they brought with them an ear-piercing howl. However, in the next moment the howl of the wind was replaced by another kind of howl. That howl was even more mournful, or perhaps even sharper. It was the sound of sword intent piercing through the air. The strand of white hair on the head of the wind wolf leader was severed by the wind. That strand of white hair was the most distinct characteristic that distinguished the wind wolf from the other wolf breed. It was also this strand of white hair that bestowed the wind wolf with a divine soul, allowing them to possess the speed of the wind. Now, this strand of white hair had been severed. The wind wolf leader let out an angry and unwilling howl. However, even this howl could not be completely emitted. It stopped in the middle, as if it had been severed by a sword. Countless cracks appeared on the white grass path. Those cracks were parallel to the direction of the mausoleum. They were like countless straight lines, blocking the path of the wind wolf pack's charge. As long as a wind wolf crossed this straight line, it would be sliced apart by an invisible force. The wolf's paw that stepped on the hard ground broke. The wolf's shoulder that carried the flying white grass broke. The wolf's tail broke. The wolf's waist broke. The wolf pack formed from several hundred wind wolves. In the instant those cracks appeared, they all broke. It was as if someone had dumped a large basket of stones on the ground, and the white grass path was filled with crashing sounds. Countless wind wolf corpses were chopped into pieces, constantly rolling on the white grass path. Some of them rolled into the swamps on the side of the path, while others were directly chopped into pieces by even more sword intent. On the path to the mausoleum, there were broken limbs and corpses everywhere. Dirty blood sprayed everywhere, turning the white grass path into a bloody path. The stench of blood was extremely pungent. As the stench of blood spread into the sky, the sword intents in the cracks also followed the rain and rose into the sky. Several thousand gray vultures flew high up in the sky, strangely quiet. These monsters were powerful and sinister. Back then, even Su Yorong had been forced to burn the last of her heavenly phoenix true blood in order to kill that flock of gray vultures. They did not roar like the other monsters. Instead, they quietly flew towards the mausoleum. It seemed like there was only the sky between them and the mausoleum. There was nothing blocking their way, making it convenient for them to launch a sneak attack. However, those sword intents had also arrived in the sky. The cracks in the grassland also seemed like they wanted to rip apart the sky. Countless miserable cries suddenly rang out. Countless broken feathers floated down, and what fell even faster to the ground of the grassland was a bewitching color of blood. Several thousand gray vultures fell one after another. For a moment, they seemed even more concentrated than the torrential rain. The countless monsters that charged towards the mausoleum all split apart, turning into mangled chunks of flesh and blood. Countless cracks appeared on the surface of the grassland. The wild grass was chopped into pieces, and the earth was chopped into gravel. Countless sword intents crisscrossed through, straight into the sky. Even the dark clouds high up in the sky were chopped into pieces, turning into countless shreds that floated in frustration. The torrential rain actually stopped just like that. The setting sun that did not seem like a sun at the edge of the grassland finally had the opportunity to shine its warm red rays of light around the mausoleum. There were corpses of monsters everywhere. Occasionally, there would be a few heavily injured monsters that did not die, constantly letting out miserable cries. The monster tide that surged towards the mausoleum stopped for a moment. They did not dare to continue forward, slowly rising and falling. This was a blood-red world. The black sea of monsters had also gradually turned into a calm red sea. After the mausoleum and the monster tide had been drenched by the rain, its color had become extremely dark. At this moment, it looked like a black reef in the middle of a red sea. No matter how fierce the wind and waves were, or how fierce the torrential rain was, it did not move in the slightest. Compared to this blood-red world and the black mausoleum, the truly shocking scene was in the grassland surrounding the mausoleum. A broken sword flew out of the grass with great difficulty, giving off a clear cry. An old sword broke out of the water, carrying with it the sound of muddy water dripping down. An ancient sword broke out of the rock, carrying with it a dull sound of friction. Several dozen swords, several hundred swords, several thousand swords, perhaps with great difficulty, perhaps with hesitation, or perhaps with joy, they broke out of the swamp and reappeared in the world. Countless swords appeared in the sky above the grassland surrounding the mausoleum. The grassland was filled with pools of water. It was more like a wetland or a grassy swamp. For several hundred years, countless people had searched for the sword pool, but no one had found it. There was not even the slightest clue. This was because no one had ever thought that the sword pool would actually be so large. The sword pool was not a mountain pool, nor was it a cold pool. Those swords had always been in this grassland. This incomparably vast grassland that stretched as far as the eye could see was the sword pool. No, how was this a pool? This was clearly a sea. A sea of swords. The grassland was quiet. Chen Chongqing stood at the edge of the stone platform, looking at the scene in front of him in silence. Previously, he had already faintly guessed at the truth of the sword pool, but when he personally saw the scene of 10,000 swords appearing, he was still shocked to the extreme. Nank stood on the divine path, looking at this scene with an expressionless face. It was unknown what she was thinking. Ningqiu covered her mouth to prevent herself from crying out, while her companion, Hua Chui, sat down in the rain. The zither-playing old man's face was abnormally pale. The zither in front of him was covered in blood, and he actually did not dare to glance behind him. Ting Xiaoming and Lu Wan withdrew their gazes and looked at each other. They could see the apology and determination in each other's eyes. No one said anything and no one moved. Even the monster tide in the grassland had slowly calmed down. This was because those swords were currently flying towards the mausoleum. Countless swords flew in the warm red light, as if they wanted to cover the sky. As they got closer and closer to the mausoleum, the tens of thousands of swords that had been washed by the rain began to shine with light, like the stars in the sky. That scene was truly very beautiful. However, those swords flew very slowly. They were not as arrogant and powerful as when they had just been born. Countless swords flew to the surroundings of the mausoleum and slowly spread out, as if they were soldiers in formation. The world was filled with sword intent. Those sword intents were once incomparably powerful, but now they were already weak. Interweaving together, they were somewhat messy. These sword intents did not have intelligence, but they did have emotions, all sorts of complicated emotions. To this mausoleum, the sword's emotions were indifference and battle intent. To the youth standing in the mausoleum, the sword's emotions were to see an old friend, to ask him to take them away. That blade was very merciless, but time was even more merciless. These swords had slept in the depths of the sea of grass for several hundred years, and had long been broken beyond repair. In the instant that they left the grassland, these swords had already exploded with their greatest strength. Yes, these swords were already old, covered in rust, and on the verge of decay. Right now, these swords were heavily injured soldiers, and they were old men walking on crutches. They should have left the battlefield long ago, and returned to the fields of old, but unfortunately, the fields here were not good, and it was not their home. It was only a cage. For several hundred years, there was not a moment that they did not want to leave this grassland, but in the end, only one of their companions succeeded, taking away their thoughts. However, that companion never returned. Until today, when these swords were about to lose all hope, their old friend finally returned to meet them. A youth had returned to this grassland with those thoughts. The swords were old, but the youth was still in his youth. Qin Chongqing's desire for freedom, his love for life, was so pure and resolute. Like a cool breeze, he had awakened them. They heard his summons and believed in his will. Thus, their ambitions reappeared. The old swords still had some power, and their broken edges could still kill enemies. Their ambitions were 1,000 li. They wanted to go 1,000 li away, to return to their homeland. I said 6,000 words, but I have to go back on my word today. This chapter only has 4,000 words. The reason is very simple. This chapter has crippled me. All my spirit is in these 4,000 words. If I continue to write, I will write unreasonably. I will make up for the 2,000 words tomorrow. Tomorrow I will update with 8,000 words. Chapter 334. From today until several hundred years ago, when Zhou Yi disappeared from the continent, countless experts were defeated by Zhou Yi. Countless famous swords were broken by his blade, and they were buried in the grassland of the Garden of Zhou. This grassland was the Sword Pool, or in other words, the Sword Sea. One of the proudest and strongest swords, after preparing for a very long time, began to attempt to leave the grassland and see the light of day again. From the edge of the grassland, it broke through the restrictions and quickly entered the small lake by the grassland, directly entering the world on the other side of the cliff. Like a fish swimming in a large lake, it then circled from the bottom of the lake back to the cold pool at the source of the stream. Using the complicated structure of the world of the Garden of Zhou, it avoided the laws within and finally succeeded. Regretfully, this sword was not completely successful. When it left the grassland, in order to resist the restrictions set by Zhou Dufu, the sword was left in the grassland, resisting the qi emitted by the stone pillars. Only the body of the sword arrived in the forest by the stream, and was gradually covered by fallen leaves. The sword and intent were forced to separate. One day, a disciple of Mount Li called Su Li came to the Garden of Zhou. He walked into the quiet forest, and stepped over the rotten leaf. He picked up the sword that was already rusted and no longer had its former elegance. Then, he brought it out of the Garden of Zhou. However, the sword intent was still trapped in the grassland, waiting silently and alone. After another several hundred years, a student of the Orthodox Academy called Qin Chongqing came to the Garden of Zhou. He held a yellow paper umbrella in his hand. The sword and intent finally met, resulting in the current 10,000 swords soaring through the sky. This history, filled with unyielding and resistance, belonged to the sword and the 10,000 swords. Qin Chongqing could not understand turning back time, so he naturally could not understand these details. However, as he held the yellow paper umbrella and stood among the 10,000 broken swords, he gained an even deeper understanding of the emotions transmitted by the sword intent. These swords wanted to leave the garden of Zhou. Other than that, there was nothing else they wanted. Then, they would leave together. Just like what he had said to the sword intent before, just like what he had said to Su Yorong, he had also made a promise to the countless swords around the mausoleum. The surroundings of the mausoleum were dusky. The red and warm rays of light became slightly colder, and there was the stench of mud and rust everywhere. Tens of thousands of old and broken swords burst out with hundreds of years of accumulated hatred and power the moment they appeared. At least 1/3 of the demon beasts were killed, and the black beast tide was temporarily suppressed. However, the beast tide was only temporarily quiet. It was impossible for the 10,000 broken swords to continue releasing such a powerful sword intent. As time passed, the beast tide surged again and roared angrily at the broken swords in the sky. It was unknown if it was because the grassland was covered in blood, but the roars seemed even more terrifying and bloody. The sword pool finally appeared. 10,000 swords soared into the sky. Seeing this scene, both the zither-playing old man and the maid paled, almost to the point of despair. Even the expressions of the powerful demon general couple became abnormally serious, and some ominous signs could even be seen in their eyes. However, there was no fear on Nank's small face. She only remained silent for a while. Separated by the countless swords, she looked at Chern Chongqing, who was in front of the mausoleum. Her voice was as cold and unyielding as thousand-year-old ice. "Do you think you can change the ending of this story just like this?" Previously, when the mountain sea sword had broken through the air, she had said something similar to Chern Chongqing. At that time, Chern Chongqing did not reply. He only gripped the heavy metal sword and pointed it at her from afar. Now, he also did not reply. Following his gaze, the several hundred swords in front of the mausoleum slowly turned and pointed at her. Actions would always be more powerful than words. They could be used to persuade people, and they could also be used to kill. Seeing this scene, the corner of Nank's lips slightly perked up. She looked at those swords and said with contempt, "A bunch of defeated swords, how can they be brave?" These swords once possessed a great reputation on the continent. Their masters were all true experts, but in the end, they were all defeated by the Having Blade. Afterwards, they were buried in this grassland by Zhou Dufu. Under the bitter wind, bitter rain, and the endless sunlight, they suffered bitterly for several hundred years. They were either broken or crippled, and their bodies were covered in rust. Nank believed that she was the successor of the Garden of Zhou, so how could she allow these swords to leave? She raised the piece of black soul wood in her hand and expressionlessly looked at the broken swords in the air around the mausoleum. Following her action, the piece of black soul wood suddenly emitted light again. However, it was even purer than before, as if it was a luminous pearl that was several thousand times brighter. At the same time, her indifferent voice rang out once again, "Defeat is defeat. You were defeated several hundred years ago, and several hundred years later, you will still be defeated." As she finished speaking, her feet left the divine path, and she slowly floated towards the sky. The remnant rain fell, and her dress and black hair fluttered. The childishness between her brows gradually faded, and only a demonic coldness remained. A powerful aura emanated from her petite body. Several dozen streams of black air, like ribbons, revolved around her body. Chern Chongqing had never looked down on this powerful, or even terrifying demon princess, not to mention the fact that she was Black Robe's only disciple. It was clear that she was related to the Garden of Zhou, so who knew what other tricks she was hiding? Hearing her disdainful and confident words, he knew that he could not allow the situation to continue like this. With a slight movement of his spiritual sense, a sword broke through the air. The heavy mountain sea sword brought with it a gust of wind as it chopped towards Nank, who was above the divine path. Ting Xiaoming and Lu Wan'er were already prepared. They rushed up, and with their powerful cultivation, they forcefully blocked the sword. The mountain sea sword was very wide, and a delicate sword was hidden behind it. In the moment of life and death, Chen Chongqing had also learned to use such cold and sinister method. That delicate maiden sword borrowed the cover of the gust of wind created by the mountain sea sword, and noiselessly broke through the obstruction of the demon general couple. It arrived in front of Nank, and with a soft swish, it pierced towards the center of her forehead. At this moment, Nank had already closed her eyes. The space between her slightly open brows was snow-white, without any emotion, and she did not see the arrival of the delicate sword. The zither-playing old man, who seemed to have lost all hope, gave a loud shout, and stepped on the floating zither strings. He took a few steps in the air, and blocked in front of Nank, using his own body to block the delicate sword. With a squelch, the delicate sword pierced through the zither-playing old man's throat, and blood sprayed out. In the gust of wind, the metal sword that was as heavy as a mountain suppressed the demon general couple. The zither-playing old man's corpse was currently falling towards the ground. Although he had blocked the maiden sword for an instant, Nank had still not woken up. How could Chen Chongqing miss this opportunity? He extended his hand and took the broken demon commander banner sword from the air, and from a distance of several hundred zhang, he chopped towards Nank. In the sky above the divine path that was drizzling with rain, there was suddenly the sound of a surging wind, as if there was an invisible flag fluttering. The battle flag fluttered, and the sword intent courageously advanced. The demon commander banner sword that had its front half broken gave off a piercingly cold sword glow. Chen Chongqing did not know the banner sword, but he wanted to try and see if he could use the sword style of the demons to break the defense of the demon princess. Unfortunately, he did not have the chance to see the result of this strike, because a warning suddenly appeared in his sea of consciousness. It made him forcefully pull back the demon commander banner sword that was about to strike, and hold it horizontally in front of his eyes. Clang! The remaining half of the demon commander banner sword violently trembled in the air at the edge of the stone platform, giving off a somewhat unwilling cry. Chen Chongqing felt a sharp pain in his wrist. If it were not for his astonishing willpower, the demon commander banner sword would have already left his hand. Where did the arrow come from? Looking around the main entrance of the mausoleum, he did not see any arrows. He only saw a hair slowly floating down from the divine path. Could it be that the thing that struck the demon commander banner sword was not an arrow, but a hair? He looked at the grassland below the mausoleum. In the center of the black ocean formed by the monster tide, the figure of a monster the size of a mountain slowly appeared. The first chapter will be written rather slowly today. In any case, I'll write 8,000 words in the end before going to sleep.